Well, hello and welcome to the Cross to Bear podcast. I don't have my intro video set up today. So if you want to watch that, you can just refer to some of my older recordings on my channel. Next time I'll have that video ready, but this time it just wasn't feasible, didn't work out. So thanks for joining us. I'm Phil Bair, I'm your host, and we're going to talk today about the resurrection debate that I did with Juan of Modern Atheism. And Dale is with me today, and he actually moderated the debate for us. And so I thought I'd bring him on and do a little bit of a debate review and maybe cover some of the arguments and some of the points that actually I wasn't able to cover during the debate. After I do a debate, I always think of all the things that I wanted to say but forgot or didn't say. So this is a chance to say some of those things and to kind of bring them back up and make some clarifications if we need to. And then also just to kind of get an overall view of how the debate went. I'm not really that concerned about who won the debate. My concern has more to do with pursuing truth than it does who wins and who loses. So, greetings, Dale. How are you doing, and what have you been up to lately?
Yeah, I've been good on my end. I've been keeping busy with a lot of podcasts in January and February, ranging from Lydia McGrew and Dr. Dale Allison to people like Juan and David Johnson and stuff like that we know. So yeah, it's been a whole mix of variety of shows, and yeah, I've got the schedule packed for February as well. So yeah, keeping busy.
Well, you're a busy beaver, aren't you?
Apparently, yeah. I guess that's good, right? It's better to keep the mind occupied.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, well, you're busier than I am, but that's by design. I try not to overwhelm myself and just pile too much stress on myself. So I hope you're handling the stress okay. Some people actually actually thrive on stress, and I don't know if you're one of those people or not, but I can handle stress when I need to, but I don't necessarily thrive on it. I don't really relish the idea of going through something stressful. So I try to keep a little bit of a lighter schedule just to make sure I don't burn out. So I don't know if that's ever a potential problem with you or not.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, like I'm not someone that thrives on stress and stuff like that, but yeah, like I would prefer, try to tone things down maybe once a week or something like that. But at the same time, yeah, like I'm not feeling too stressed out about maybe like two a week. When I was on Faith Unaltered, I was doing like five or six a week, and that was just way too much. That was where I was kind of stressing out. So yeah, that's where I
Hmm.
kind of fit in there. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and what a lot of people don't realize is that it's not just the time that we're on the air; it's the time that we need to do to prep. And so a lot of times there's a lot of research to be done, and that can actually be very time consuming. It's far more time consuming than just having a conversation on a live stream. So that's a big part of it. But I want to get back to the debate real quick. I really enjoy having conversations with Juan, and I have said this before, but I will say it again. And I hope that Juan could join us today. I hope that he can listen in. And but I've always enjoyed speaking with Juan and having a debate with Juan because he is so genuine and he is so I would say humble. I think he is a humble guy. I don't think that I've never seen any arrogance or spite coming from him whatsoever. I've always seen nothing but sincerity and honesty. And boy, I celebrate that. I don't just value it, I celebrate it.
Damn, yeah, I agree. I can't think of any time when there's been like any kind of arrogance or mocking. Like he he doesn't take after like the Apologia or the Pine Creek Doug types. I think he just wants a genuine conversation, and that's been my experience in any show that I've seen him in. So yeah, I would agree fully. Like he's just there for the conversation, and you know, the last show I did with him, we were debating the argument for God from beauty, and again, that was a very honest and sincere discussion. So yeah, it went great
And cordial, yeah.
and cordial. Yeah.
Well, there's no one that I would rather debate than Juan. And it's not because I think that I can win every debate with him. Um, I just enjoy his pleasant personality, and he learns something. I think he learns something, and I think he's willing to learn. And sometimes, whether it's an atheist or a theist, it doesn't really matter. Sometimes we can be resistant to learning new things, and we can think that we have all the answers. And I certainly don't have the answers. I could be wrong about a great many things, and I'm not infallible. And Juan doesn't come to the table with the attitude of, I have all the answers, and allow me to school you in my ideology, and allow me to set you straight on everything you've got wrong. That's not his attitude at all. So I just want to preface our discussion today just with an acknowledgement, just with a shout out to Juan, how much I value him, and I think that we could be great friends if we ever had a chance to spend time together, just because he's just such a genuine person. So
Fair enough. And not to put you on the spot, because I wouldn't be able to answer this since, you know, it's been, I think, 2 months since we did the debate. But if you do remember, was there something that you learned from Juan? Like, was there a takeaway for you that really stood out that you remember, kind of thing, as well?
well, let me start by saying that none of the arguments that he presented were anything I've heard that I haven't heard before. I mean, I have heard all of the objections against the resurrection that he laid out that day. Now, that doesn't mean I didn't learn anything, because sometimes one brings up ideas that surround some of those objections that I've heard that I've never heard before. So he can nuance those things, and when he nuances those objections, even if I've heard the objection before, I haven't heard his nuances, and so there's a lot of that I can learn from Juan, because sometimes he has a little bit of a fresh perspective on some of those traditional objections to the resurrection, and so I learned from that, and it actually sharpens my position, and it sharpens my apologetic toward the resurrection. And I can't say that any of them that I'm aware of have actually diminished my confidence in the resurrection, but I do gain a lot of insight just from Juan. I think that he's a creative guy. I don't when he presented those arguments, I made the comment that I have heard them all before, but when I said that, I didn't mean to diminish his approach to this, and that wasn't to just simply shut him down and say, "Okay, Juan, I'm not interested in anything you have to say." So I think that's always valuable, and if I did learn something, then I'm glad that I learned something. If I didn't learn something, then I'm going to be disappointed. I'm actually disappointed if I go through a show or go through a debate and I haven't learned something by the end of it, then I feel like I haven't fulfilled all of my checklist, my whole objectives at that point. And I don't know if you feel the same way or not, but
Yeah, I do. I enjoy being able to learn, but not just learn the lesson in the moment, but something that retains with you and sticks with you. So like, okay, it improves you going forward and stuff like that. Because so yeah, that's what I look for, kind of thing. Is when I do a show or a debate, I try to, okay, let's land at least one point with them, and vice versa. Is there one point that lands with me that I can try to hold on to and stuff like that to make me better?
right.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
At least one. If
Well,
I could do more, that's great. But my memory isn't what it used to be. So,
yeah. What was your name again?
George, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was a good debate, and when we were originally scheduled to do this much earlier, I think before the holidays, but then life got in the way, and I did actually go over the debate again, and I made sure to record.
Okay,
Oh, sorry.
Dale. Real quick, Dale. You have a lot of static in your audio. Are you having any trouble with your microphone or anything like that? But
No, I just have okay, tell me if it goes away when I do this. Is it gone now?
okay.
Yeah.
Well, it's gone, but it was gone when you said, tell me if it goes away." So you're clear now. So
Okay.
if you could repeat what you said earlier, because you said something about we were supposed to do this earlier, and I didn't catch a lot of that just because there was a lot of static interference. So
No problem. So yeah, I was just saying. So in preparation for that, I went and I rewatched the debate, and I did actually take notes, just of your major arguments, because you had three arguments, and one had a total of five, and stuff like that. So I found that in terms of your approach, it was an interesting approach. It's not the typical Gary Habermas.
okay, you're buried in static again. So a lot of your audio is cutting out, and the audio that I can hear with your voice has a lot of static on it. So it's gone back to your static phase, and apparently it goes in and out. So I don't know if you can identify what the problem is on your end, but I'm not going to be able to hear a lot of what you're saying if you still have that problem. So I don't know if you have a bad connection, loose cable or something like that.
Just checking setting. Noise, echo cancellation, noise suppression is ticked.
Okay. Well, every time I bring it up and you respond to it, you're clear again. But then when you start talking,
Oh,
yeah, so you're clear right now, but every time you start talking, it eventually degrades to a lot of static, and then you begin to cut out again. So I don't know if it's something that has some kind of a time frame based on it, because when you first start making comments, everything is clear, and then eventually it degrades into static again. So I don't know if you can identify the problem. Let's just go ahead and move forward and see if we can, and just kind of hope that it's not going to rear its ugly head again. But you mentioned that we wanted to do this earlier, and that you took notes and you did a little bit of a review of the debate yourself, and so that's about all I heard the last time you made those comments.
yeah. So I was just mentioning that I think you had three arguments for your positive case, and one had a total of five counter arguments and stuff. And I was just kind of saying, like, I've thought that your three approaches to your arguments were interesting, because it wasn't the typical way of arguing for the resurrection, the Gary Habermas approach or the William Lane Craig type approach. So I was just going to mention that, and kind of ask you, like, what was sort of the inspiration to take sort of, I think you called it an epistemic arguments for the resurrection. Why do you think those are better arguments compared to, like, the traditional approach to the resurrection? What was your motivation to take that approach?
Well, what I did was I went back and tried to take a fresh look at the Gospels and the Book of Acts, and I just wanted to just examine the nature of the apostles' witness of the resurrection. And what I discovered is that, and when I said what was the nature of their witness, what I mean by that is that I wanted to go back and examine what the nature of their proclamation was. And there's a lot of background information about Paul meeting with Peter, going to Jerusalem and meeting with Peter early on. And so there's a lot of background information that's associated with that. And I think that's a lot of what Gary Habermas will focus on and does focus on. And I think that's extremely valuable and extremely powerful. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to just look at the proclamation itself. And the first thing that strikes me about the proclamation of the disciples is, and this is the main thing that strikes me about it, and that is that it is all about confidence. When they made the proclamation that Jesus Christ had risen from the dead, they weren't guessing. They weren't giving people a suggestion. They weren't giving people an opinion. They were proclaiming the resurrection of Christ as though they knew it as well as they knew anything else in their entire lives. And so they proclaimed it with absolute confidence and self-assurance. And so I began to ask the question, why are they so confident in this proclamation that Jesus rose from the dead? Because you're speaking to first century Jewish culture, and you're speaking to a group, an audience that either didn't believe that people rose from the dead at all, or you're speaking to an audience that thought that there was a resurrection of the body, but it didn't happen until the end of the age. So a resurrection in the middle of history was a completely foreign concept to them. So they were automatically speaking to what could potentially be a hostile audience that would be resistant to this claim that Jesus had risen from the dead. But they proclaimed it with absolute confidence anyway. And so what I began to do is I thought, I need to explore what the basis of this confidence was. And so that's how I came up with my 3 epistemic arguments for the resurrection. And those arguments are about the fact that they proclaimed it with such incredible boldness in the face of a culture that would be hostile to their message, potentially, maybe not always, but there's a lot of potential hostility to that message. And they proclaimed it to an audience that could easily, and I mean easily, refute and discredit their whole witness. The people living around that area at the time that they proclaimed that resurrection, most of them were alive when all of these events allegedly occurred. And so they could have easily debunked the resurrection narrative. They could have shut them down, and they could have laughed in their faces, and they could have laughed them out of all of the lecture halls and all of the venues, in which they were making this proclamation. So it would have been the easiest thing in the world to debunk at the time. And that is why I am so impressed with the confidence of their proclamation. The only way that they can get away with that kind of claim, that kind of bold, outrageous claim in the first century, was that if it was true. And they knew that it was true. And that's why I came up with the argument that if the claim was false, then no one knew that better than the disciples did. And so as I look at the Gospels and the book of Acts, what I see is Jesus telling his disciples, "You are my witnesses." And my whole argument is based on that fact right there, that claim, that idea. You guys are my witnesses. And so they proclaimed the resurrection in Jerusalem, right where everything happened, right where the crucifixion occurred, right where the burial occurred. And to be able to boldly claim and proclaimed that message right there in the city where it all happened, there's no way they could have gotten away with that unless it was true. And I think that's the reason why their proclamation was so bold, and that was the reason why they were willing to be put to death for that claim, because they knew it was the truth. And during the debate, and by the way, Juan has joined us, and I see a message here that says hello guys, and so hello, shout back to Juan.
I let him know about it right before. So yeah, awesome that he made it. Hey Juan.
Okay. All right. I don't know if he's still here or not, but
yeah, he's
but he did say. Okay.
Go ahead.
But anyway, so during the debate, Juan brought up a very good point, and it's a point that needs to be addressed, and so I'm glad that he brought it up. Like I said, Juan has done his homework on this, and so I compliment Juan on the fact that he's done his homework, and he actually speaks to other Christian apologists, and so he's not a newbie here. He's not out of the loop. So, and one of the things that he brought up was that we don't have extremely strong historical evidence that all of the apostles except for John were martyred for their faith. And so when I make the argument that the disciples were willing to die before they were willing to retract their claim that Jesus had risen from the dead, the counter argument to that is, well, we don't know that they all died for their faith. But that's not really my argument. My argument is not they died for their faith, for their resurrection claim. My argument is that they were willing to die for their claim, for their resurrection claim. And we know that they were willing to, even if we don't know that they actually did. And that's a huge differentiation. That's a big distinction that we need to focus on. And the reason that we know that they were willing to die is because I treat the book of Acts as reliable history, and we can talk about that, by the way, because that did come up in the debate. And Juan said, how do you know the book of Acts is reliable history? But I do treat the book of Acts as reliable history. I believe that we can treat it as reliable history. And the book of Acts is not some obscure tradition that tells us that the apostles died for their faith. The book of Acts records the actual events that took place with the disciples and how they interacted with the Jewish authorities and with the Roman authorities by extension. So the Jewish authorities had the authority to put them to death if they wanted to. They had already put their hero, their master, to death. They already put their rabbi, their teacher, to death. That's Jesus. So that we know that the Jewish authorities had the ability and the authority to have someone put to death, whether it was at the hands of their own temple guard or whether it was at the hands of the Romans. So the apostles knew very well that the people that they were defying when they disobeyed the order to stop preaching the resurrection of Christ publicly, they knew that the people they were defying had the authority and the ability to put them to death. So they proclaimed it anyway. The Jewish authorities put them in jail, and they beat them. And when they got out of jail, the very next day, after having been ordered not to preach the resurrection, the very next day, what did they do? They started preaching the resurrection again. And it's almost comical that when I read that, in the book of Acts, I think it's Acts chapter 5 maybe, but it's almost comical when I read that, because I read they beat them, they threw them in jail, and they sternly warned them never to preach the resurrection again. And the next day they went out and started preaching the resurrection again. And I just love that narrative, because it speaks to how unbelievably confident they were in that message. And they said we have to obey God rather than men. And so they never apologized for it, and they knew very well that if they went out the next day and started preaching Christ's crucifixion and resurrection again, they knew very well that that could have been it for them. They could have been put to death by the end of the day, the next day. And so the argument is not, did the disciples die for their faith and for their claim to the resurrection? The argument is, were they willing to? And even if the biblical or historical evidence that they did die for their faith is weak, the evidence that they were willing to is strong. And that's something that I didn't really focus on with that much intensity during the debate. And I after the debate was over, I wish I had. so
Fair enough.
so you can give me your thoughts on that, Dale.
Yeah. So I think you're talking about your first argument here, based on the conviction of the apostles. And if you just can I share my screen just to show the audience your argument in premise format quickly, so they can have a context?
Sure.
Okay, slideshow. Yeah. Let me know when that's popping up.
Yep, it's there.
Yeah. So this was Phil's first debug argument, right? So premise one is, if the res did not occur, the apostles would know that it didn't occur. Premise two is, the apostles were convinced, or in other words, they knew the resurrection did occur. Premise three, it's impossible to be convinced of what you know is false. In other words, it's impossible to know what you know didn't happen, kind of thing.
Okay, hold on. You're breaking up again. Can you start that premise 3 again, real quick?
Yeah. So it's impossible to be convinced, aka know, what you know is false, unless you are insane. I would say even if you're insane, it's impossible to have knowledge of something that's false. But premise 4, the apostles were not insane, therefore the resurrection actually occurred. And I think what you're talking about with Acts, you were saying you wanted to give support for this premise too, from the book of Acts, right? Like, how do we prove they actually were convinced? Well, it's because they were willing to suffer and even go to the point of death for their beliefs.
Okay, you're cutting out again, Dale. I wish we could resolve this technical difficulty. You're definitely cutting out. But let me address something that you said there. If you could can you put that argument back up on the screen again, real quick? Okay, so if the resurrection did not occur, all right, we're getting. Can you mute yourself, Dale? Okay. Well, we're getting echo again. I don't know why.
Right, let me try and share again without sharing my sound. I think maybe that's where I made the mistake, but I'll mute.
That's it. Okay. All right, no echo. Thank you. That's the key right there. Don't share your sound, just share the screen. So let me just review this and then comment on something that you commented on. If the res did not occur, the apostles knew that it did not occur, and you have it rendered the apostles would know that it did not occur, and I think that's a good way to put it. But I think it's an even more powerful way to put it to say if the resurrection did not occur, the apostles knew that it did not occur. Because they were, and what you said isn't necessarily bad. It's just that they were in the position to know that it did not occur. If they knew, if their proclamation was false, they knew it was false. If everything they said about the resurrection appearances, cooking fish over a fire with Jesus and having conversations with Jesus. Peter had a conversation with Jesus that he claimed that he had where Jesus said to Peter, do you love me? And Peter says, of course I love you. And Jesus says, feed my sheep, feed my lambs. So if the resurrection did not occur, that conversation never took place. And if that conversation never took place, Peter knew that conversation never took place. And so that's why I want to say this is something that he knew, not something. Okay, can you keep that screen up? You have a screen loop. You have a screen loop going.
Yeah, no, I wanted to unmute because I wanted to ask you a question, but yeah, I'll let you finish. But I'm going to question this premise after you're done. This first premise, okay?
Okay. Well, all right, but and by the way, Juan, if you're still here, give us another chat here, and because I would love to hear your thoughts on this as well. Let us know that you're still here if you don't mind, if you are. But if the resurrection didn't occur, the apostles knew that it didn't occur because they knew that all of those conversations that they claimed they had with Jesus never took place. And that's part of the reason for my premise that if the resurrection did not take place, the apostles knew it didn't take place. They knew they were lying when they claimed to have all these conversations, when they claimed to be having conversations with Jesus post-resurrection. But then you said, but even though they knew that it did not take place, if it didn't take place, then my next premise is that they were convinced that the resurrection did take place. And you substituted the word convinced with the word knew. And I want to keep those two concepts separate, because you can be convinced of something without knowing something. I could be convinced that it's raining outside, but I could be mistaken if you prove that it's not raining outside, but yet I'm convinced that it is because there's some noise outside that sounds like rain. I could be absolutely convinced that it's raining outside, but I could still be wrong. And so being convinced of something and knowing something are two different things. And so it seemed like, Dale, you were making those things the same thing. You were saying they knew that the resurrection took place because they were convinced that the resurrection took place. So they knew something, and they knew something was true, and they knew something was false. And that's not my argument. My argument is not they knew that it was true and they knew that it was false. My argument is they were convinced that it was true, but being convinced is not the same as actually having authentic knowledge. And so that's where the disconnect is with the apostles in their mental state. Because if you know that something is false, but you are convinced that it is true, then you have a mental disorder. I'm not saying you personally, Dale. I'm just saying that anybody who knows that something is false and yet is convinced that it's true, those two things are logically exclusive. They're incompatible unless you're insane. So that's really the drift of premise 2. It's not they knew that it was true, they knew that it was false. It was they were convinced that it was true, but they knew that it was false. So if the resurrection didn't occur, the apostles knew that it didn't occur because they had firsthand knowledge of all the things that they claimed were true, and they would have firsthand knowledge that those things are false. They would have firsthand knowledge that their claims about having conversations with Jesus after the resurrection, after he had died, were false. But they proclaimed the resurrection in such a way that they were willing to die for that claim, and that proves that they were convinced that it was true. So we have historical evidence that's reliable that tells us they were convinced that this resurrection claim was true. But if it did not occur, then we can know that they knew that it didn't occur. And that is what the entire drift of the argument is all about. So give me your feedback on what you wanted to mention earlier. I didn't mean to cut you off there, but I wanted to make sure I made that clarification so that there wasn't any misunderstanding.
No problem. Perfect. Okay. So given that clarification of the terms, then, so I can see. So I think one would definitely object to premise 2. Obviously, I as a Christian would agree with you that they were convinced the resurrection occurred and that sort of thing. But there could be an objection coming from, well, look, Phil, you're just assuming all these accounts in Acts and stuff are fully historical, and even some of the most conservative biblical scholars like Michael Cohen and Craig Keener, who believe in that.
Okay, Dale, I'm sorry to interrupt you again, but you're cutting out again. You're buried in static, and I'm only hearing half of your words. What I think we should do is why don't you exit the studio and then rejoin the studio and see if that makes any difference, and see if that helps the static problem, because it's really making it impossible for us to have a conversation, and it's possible to hear what you're saying. So can you go ahead and exit the studio and then rejoin?
Yep.
So let me apologize to the audience for all of our technical difficulties today. I'm not sure what the cause of it is, but hopefully Dale and I can get them straightened out before the next time we actually have a live stream. And Juan, are you still there? I just wanted to see if you were. I only saw your initial comment, "Hello guys," and I'm glad to have you, but I wanted to make sure you're still here. I don't know if you are or not. So give us a little shout out again if you are. And then I would love to hear any input that you might have. So after all, you were the guy that I was debating. So if we're going to do a debate review, it'd be nice to get feedback from you on that. So we're waiting for Dale to rejoin us in the studio, and hopefully we'll have a better connection once he does that. And in the meantime, this might be a good idea, or a good time to let everybody know that I've just published a new book, my 7th book. It's called Deconstructing Junk Theology, and you can find that on Amazon if you just do a search for Phil Bair or the search for the title. So, all right, Dale is back, and let's see if we can bring him back on. Let's see if we have a better connection, and we can see if we can. Hopefully, we've solved our static problem. So, Dale.
Yep. Testing 1, 2, 3. I'm back. Hopefully, no static.
None so far, but
No.
it never shows up right away.
Okay. And a fire alarm. Perfect timing. All right. So I'll ask this quick then. So I think I could raise objections to personally to premise 1 and 3, and I can see Juan raising an objection to premise 2. So let's start with premise 1 and take it one at a time. So before static comes. So if the resurrection did not occur, the apostles would know that it did not occur. Now, even David Paulman, who's a fellow Christian, he objected and said this is a false premise because maybe it's possible the apostles were deluded into thinking that the resurrection occurred, even though it didn't really, through a hallucination or something like that. So I think this premise, you're utilizing certain details as part of the warrant for this premise, right? That rules out all these explanations, where rules out that they were mistaken. Is that correct?
Yeah, because here's one of the main reasons why I think that David Paulman is mistaken here, or that this objection fails, and that is that we have detailed conversations that the apostles claimed took place, and we have a proclamation from the apostles that says, we are witnesses of these things. This is what we saw and heard. And so, if they did not see and hear those things, well, let me put it this way. If the resurrection did not occur, then they did not see and hear those things. They did not have those conversations with Jesus post-resurrection, and they knew that Jesus did not rise from the dead if he in fact did not rise from the dead, because they were there. They were there at the time, and if you want to say that they were deluded somehow, then that's an ad hoc explanation, unless someone can come up with evidence that something deluded them. And my question is, what was it that caused that delusion in the disciples that Jesus Christ had risen from the dead?
Okay. So, and believe it or not, I think David Paulman, he would agree with you against other scholars. Like, he takes a reportage model for the Gospels and Acts as well, and that sort of thing. But so just to clarify, from your standpoint, are you assuming a reportage model, just to clarify, versus Mike Licona or Gary Habermas, who would say, well, no, we can't assume that the details of the Gospels or the resurrection accounts are historical unless we prove them through the use of certain criteria and stuff. So there are those two approaches. I think you're using the former. Is that correct? Or
Well, I don't know if I would necessarily categorize it that way, but I am simply examining what they said, what they claimed to have seen and heard. And if you want to call that reportage, I don't, whatever, but they claimed that they saw and heard the resurrected Jesus. They claimed that they saw him alive, and they claimed that they talked to him, and that they claimed that he talked to them. There was a historical claim that he appeared to lots of disciples at various times, and those appearances and those encounters were recorded with specific detail, the kind of detail that you would get from an eyewitness. So we have a report, and if I'm using the word report, so maybe I'm talking about a reportage model.
yeah,
I don't know, but
it sounds like you are.
okay. but I don't know that I want to necessarily commit to everything, all the implications of a reportage model, because there may be more to it than just simply I'm examining a report, I'm examining a claim, I'm examining something that I'm examining a historical narrative that came from a witness, from an eyewitness.
Yeah.
And so we have a claim, a historical claim, if you want to call it a report, that's fine, that he appeared to the disciples in a room with locked doors, and that Thomas was skeptical because of their prior reports when he wasn't present. And so Jesus appears to the disciples again, and Thomas was there this time. And Jesus said to Thomas, "Put your hands in my side and touch me and make whatever tactile or empirical observations that you want to make, and and I your encounter with me right now should verify that I am Jesus, the one that you knew before I was crucified, and that I was dead, and that now I'm alive." And Thomas fell at his feet and said, "My Lord and my God." So Thomas was convinced based on the evidence that Jesus provided for him. If the resurrection did not occur, that entire narrative is false. But the disciples reported, and again, I'm using the word report again, so, and which is fine. But the disciples claimed that event occurred. And if the event did not occur, who would have known that it did not occur? The disciples. So I don't think that we can shy away from this proposition that if the resurrection did not occur, the apostles knew that it did not occur because they knew that all of those claims that they had made, they knew that all those descriptions of those encounters and conversations, those conversations never took place. And they had to have known it. How and the other explanation is they were convinced that it was true, but I have yet to hear anybody explain to me how it is that they would not have known that they were false if they were false. In other words, the apostles knew that what they were telling people was not true. They knew that they were lying to people. And I don't know how you cannot know that. And so my question again, I'll restate the question, and that is that if they were deluded somehow, what was it that caused that delusion? Because if no one can give me any evidence that something was deluding them, then it's simply an ad hoc explanation, and it's simply the ad hoc fallacy. So you can tell me what you think.
So okay, so I think again, in terms of the premise, it's your premise. So we have the initial burden of proof here to prove it, and I'm just trying to think. For Juan, he's not going to just grant the gospel details at face value, right? As an atheist, he's going to require some kind of justification for why should I trust that they had conversations, like some of the whatever details you're using to say how could they be deluded, that having a full conversation, they would of course know that didn't happen or not, or touching and eating, whatever the details are that you are arguing makes it impossible for a delusion or improbable. You have to prove those details, and that's what I was asking you. I think your approach to proving it is you would say, well, look, I'm justified, I can prove to you that the gospels in general are reliable reports or eyewitness testimonial reports, whereby we can trust these details that I need to make my point. And I just wanted to confirm it. Like, is that because obviously it's not there in the premise? So I think that was something that could have been said in the debates if Juan challenged you on that front, because otherwise he'll just say, well, I don't believe Jesus did talk to anybody. That's just a legend made up in the Gospel of John. The doubting
Well,
Thomas story, I don't believe that and stuff. You know
yeah,
what I mean?
but that's not what Juan has to deny. What Juan has to deny is that the disciples actually claimed that they had those conversations. Because if you accept the historical narrative that the disciples went out and told people that they had had those conversations, that they had encountered the risen Christ, that they had seen him alive. If you want to attack that premise, what you would have to do is you would have to say, hey, this history that says that this is what these guys claimed and proclaimed is unreliable history. So I don't even believe the disciples actually went out and told people that they had seen Jesus alive.
Yeah, I think you're right. That's a good point. Yeah, he would deny that the disciples claimed those specific accounts, I guess, and then you would say, no,
Okay.
we can trace it back. These claims are traceable back to the original disciples and stuff.
Okay, so what that brings us to is it brings us to the epistemic approach of historiography. And where does the burden of proof lie in historiography? And I would argue that in historiography, the burden of proof rests with the skeptic and not with the narrator, not with the one who is relying on the historical data. So the burden of proof is not on me. The burden of proof is not on me to prove that the book of Acts or that the Gospels that describe the resurrection appearances are reliable history. The burden of proof is on the skeptic to show that they are not reliable history. The skeptic has to discredit the historical reliability of the Gospels. I don't have to prove the historical reliability of the Gospels. And this is one thing that I learned from a scholar by the name of Simon Greenleaf. Dale, have you ever heard of Simon Greenleaf?
I have, yeah. He's a great scholar. I loved his book when he was tackling Bart Ehrman on the divinity of God and stuff. So yeah.
Yeah.
No, sorry,
right.
that's Simon Gathercole. Sorry, yeah, but I know Greenleaf. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, Simon Greenleaf, I think is I don't think he's contemporary of Bart Ehrman, but anyway, Simon Greenleaf, and I can't think of his primary work. Let me look it up real quick.
Some legal or something, right? From remembering.
Treatise on the Law of Evidence, 1842. Mm-hmm. And he published this when he was a professor at Harvard Law School. And so if you read his treatise on the law of evidence, what you will discover, and this, by the way, this is textbook. Simon Greenleaf wrote the textbook on historiography, or one of them. And his entire approach to historiography is you accept a historical account unless you have a reason not to. And one of the reasons why you would not want to accept a historical account is that there is a historical corrective. And I talked about this in the debate when I discussed all of the conversations that I've had with Dr. Craig Blomberg. Craig Blomberg is a great friend of mine. He and I have been friends for decades, and he and I used to meet on a regular basis. We still do. We still meet for lunch and have conversations. But we had almost monthly meetings, and we talked about the historiography of the New Testament. And he wrote a book called The Historical Reliability of the Gospels. If you ever have any doubt about the historical reliability of the Gospels, read his book. It's called The Historical Reliability of the Gospels. and so if you read Blomberg, and if you read Greenleaf, Blomberg makes the point that if there is no historical corrective, in other words, if somebody doesn't come forward and say, "Hey, I heard that somebody is making these historical claims out there, and I was there. I know that it didn't happen," and so a historical corrective would emerge in history. And when it comes to something this monumental, any kind of historical corrective would be pounced on, and no one can simply make the argument from ignorance and say, well, there was a historical corrective, but we just don't have it, And so that's Blomberg's one of Blomberg's main points is no historical corrective, then this historical narrative and historical claim has not been discredited. And Simon Greenleaf comes up and he says, you accept a historical narrative unless you have a reason not to. And there are several reasons why you may want to doubt any historical narrative. And one of them is that it doesn't pass the internal consistency test, that there's incoherence, and there are other tests that you can make about the internal evidence of a given narrative. Does it have eyewitness details, and so on? So, and we could do a whole show, by the way, on the internal evidence test for trying to evaluate historical narratives. But if a historical account passes the internal evidence test, and there are no historical correctives out there, then you accept it as a fact of history. And by the way, William Lane Craig has also done a lot of work in this area, and he has challenged this modern historical skepticism, where he comes out and he says, guys, there's historical skepticism out there that says that there's no such thing as an indisputable historical fact. And William Lane Craig does a masterful job of debunking that idea, that myth. There is such a thing as an indisputable historical fact, and to deny it means that we're going to have to simply deny entire swaths of human knowledge altogether. So this is a roundabout way of saying that, and let me restate it a little bit and review a little bit. What I'm saying is that the burden of proof for the reliability of a historical narrative is on the skeptic. It is not on the one who affirms the reliability of the narrative, a narrative that has passed the internal evidence test. And there's also the external evidence test as well, and we could talk about that, but that's part of Juan's argument. And a historical account does not need external corroboration for it to be reliable. It's just that external corroboration is a luxury, but it's not a necessity for accepting a historical narrative or a historical account. Okay, so tell me your thoughts.
Okay, so I think I definitely would agree with William Lane Craig's point about, yeah, there are historical facts that can be proven 100% with absolute knowledge. As a logician, I disagree. Again, there may be more context to what Greenleaf is saying. Like maybe he's talking about a principle of testimony or something like that. So whereby the testimony is evidence in and of its own right to be believed. So like I may agree with him, but just the way that you asserted it, I would say, look, whoever makes the claim has the burden of proof. So you do have a burden of proof to, and maybe you're saying, maybe Simon Greenleaf is saying, well, that burden of proof is met by presenting the document itself. Now, the only thing I would want to ask you on before I move on to my next point, because I don't want to, just harbor on this one thing, but if that's true, then if that's true about your approach, why are you a Christian? Why don't you believe Muhammad split the moon in half? We have a document that says it, and it's dated really early. It's earlier than our Gospels. I think we actually have a physical manuscript that dates 15 years. This shocked me. 15 years after the death of Muhammad.
Okay.
That's
Well,
yeah.
well, I have to push back a little bit and correct something that you said, that you accept a document just because it's been presented to us. And that's not my argument.
Okay.
My argument is that you accept a historical account because the historical data has been presented to us, and it doesn't fail any of the historical tests that historians naturally and routinely use to try to authenticate a historical account. So it's not just the presentation of the document. It's not at all. It's the presentation of the document, and then you put the document through a range of tests to make sure that it passes those tests, and those tests are the same kinds of tests that we use to test any historical account. Any historical account of antiquity, but even any historical account today. And so the reason that I reject the record of a lot of what Muhammad did is because it doesn't pass those tests, not because the document or the data hasn't been presented.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense then. Yeah, you've got these criteria to establish the reliability of the testimony in the document and stuff. Okay, cool. So the other thing I wanted to ask you about, it comes with premise 3. You're saying it's impossible to be convinced, and the convince you specified is this mental state, right? Psychological certainty for
Right.
what you know is false. But because now that I understand you're distinguishing those two things, it is possible to actually be convinced of what you know is false. And we've proven this, for example, when it comes to, like, I have subconscious knowledge, a warranted true belief that something's false, but I'm just not consciously aware of it. And so because of that, I can have psychological certainty. So like that would be the other premise 3 would be the other one that I would sort of question. Yeah.
All right.
What's your
Well, the way that I would comment on that is that if you have a subconscious certainty, is that what you said? Subconscious certainty? What was? Tell me what the term was again.
so we can have subconscious knowledge. It's possible to have a
Subconscious
warranted.
knowledge.
Yeah.
Okay. I dispute the fact that there's such a thing as subconscious knowledge. Because if it is subconscious and you are not aware of it, then it's not knowledge. You have to be aware that a proposition is true and justified in order for it to count as knowledge. If you're not aware of that proposition, then you cannot have knowledge in that sense. Knowledge has to be conscious. It can't. I don't think there's such a thing as subconscious knowledge. I think that's a contradiction in terms.
Okay. Yeah. Well, okay. I'll give one last comeback, and I'll let you get the last word. So I think that's wrong, right?
We're gonna have a debate.
Like you and I, we both know that David Johnson exists, but it was subconscious knowledge on our part up until I mentioned his name, and we became aware. Yeah, David Johnson is a person that exists. We've debated him, stuff like that, right? But before 5 minutes ago, when neither you nor me were thinking of David Johnson, the knowledge of his existence was subconscious knowledge. We had a warranted true belief, but we weren't consciously cognizant of it. And I also think another good proof, if you want a biblical example, is Jesus. Because otherwise you're going to have to say, well, Jesus is not omniscient, and I think he clearly is as the God the Son. So the only way, well, how can he not know when the day of the end will come. How does that make sense? Is that a denial of omniscience? No, I think it's saying he knows, but it's
Mhm.
subconscious knowledge. But
No,
that was
no,
my
I
answer.
don't think,
Go ahead.
I would dispute that. I would say it's not subconscious knowledge. When Jesus did not know the hour, the day or the hour of his coming, the way that we explain that is not that it was subconscious knowledge. The way that we explain that is that Jesus had two natures, the hypostatic union. He has a divine nature and a human nature. And in his human nature, he can withhold certain knowledge from himself in his human existence, in his human nature. And but in his divine nature, he has that knowledge because in his divinity, he's omniscient. But when he is incarnate on earth and living as a man and operating within his human nature, he can voluntarily withhold certain knowledge from his human nature, from his mannishness, even though he has that knowledge in his divine nature. His divine nature is not subconscious, and his human nature simply does not have that knowledge because he voluntarily decides that he's going to live a life as a human being, and in his human nature, he can voluntarily withhold certain divine attributes. And since that's the case, if he voluntarily withholds his divine omniscience on certain occasions from his human nature, then that is not it's not a matter of the conscious versus the subconscious. That's a matter of God, of Jesus knowing something in his nature, and and but withholding that knowledge from his human side, is if that makes any sense. So I don't think you can know something but not be thinking about it at any given moment. That doesn't mean that you know something subconsciously. It just means that you know something and you're not thinking about it right now. That's much different than actually having knowledge in your subconscious mind that you're not even aware of. So I would dispute in the strongest terms the idea that we can know something but not be aware that we know it because it's in our subconscious. So I don't know if you want to let that be the last word on this subject or not. I mean, you don't have to if you don't want to, but
Yeah, well, I think yeah, I think we both get like we I think we would disagree on that aspect. But I just have one quick follow-up question just out of interest for me because it's something I've never understood about the natures of Jesus. So like when I use nature, I have sort of a modern metaphysical understanding. Natures aren't persons; they aren't minds. They're a set of essential properties for being a kind of thing, and sets of properties they don't know anything. They can't have knowledge. They're a set of abstract properties that a thing has. So I was going to ask you. I saw you kind of nodding at that, but I was wondering if you had something different by nature's in mind. Like, how could a nature have knowledge if it's not a person with a mind or something?
I'm not saying that a nature has knowledge or that a nature is person. I'm saying that a nature can affect what a person can know and what a person can't know. A nature can affect how people behave. A nature doesn't have to be a person in order to have an influence on how a person behaves and acts and thinks. And so the point stands that Jesus had two natures, and he had a divine nature and he had a human nature. And 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 by the way, let's think about this for a second. What we're saying is that the disciples were making a whole lot of claims about that they had encounters with the risen Christ. And so if they in their subconscious knew that their claims were false, my question is, how does that work? They knew that their claims were false subconsciously. If I stand here and tell you that I just had a conversation with George Washington 2 hours ago, and I told you, I had a conversation with George Washington 2 hours ago. Am I going to not know that that's false? And am I going to know that it's false subconsciously, but still be convinced that it's true consciously? I I would like to hear someone explain to me how that works. To me, that is completely incoherent. Because if I tell you that I had a conversation with George Washington 2 hours ago, I know consciously that that wasn't true, because I'm the one making the claim, so it actually has to come back to this idea of that they were deluded. And the reason that they were convinced was because they had some kind of delusion. And my question at that point is, where did that delusion come from? Where's the evidence that that delusion occurred, and what was its cause? And I haven't heard that yet. So if David Paulman wants to say that they had some kind of that they could have had some kind of a delusion that they were encountering the resurrected Christ, but that in their subconscious they knew that it wasn't true. Where's the evidence? I mean, where's the basis for making that claim? I'm not going to just accept that assertion just without any kind of basis or argument or evidence for it.
Fair enough. Yeah. Yeah. And I think Paulman would disagree with hallucinate. He's a Christian like us. So he would probably agree with you and me on that, against that stuff. But yeah, that's a good point. Juan did mention, as a counter to this, what was the root cause. I think he mentioned specifically bereavement hallucinations was what came up in your debate. And if he was making a claim, like if he's saying, look, historically this is what happened, this is, or he's submitting this as his hypothesis, he also has a burden of proof to prove that this actually happened. And right. I think in your debate, you guys, again, it's been a while, but I think you did get into certain problems with the hallucination hypothesis. Was that correct when you were countering one? Yeah. And it's
yeah, we did.
Yeah.
Well, my objection against the hallucination theory is not that it's improbable. My objection to the hallucination theory is that there's no evidence for it. And if you make a claim and there's some kind of bold assertion that all the apostles, they all suffer from the exact same hallucination, that's a pretty bold claim. And the problem that I have with it is not that it's improbable, it's that you haven't given me any evidence why I should believe it. But if you do want to go to the probability argument, I would say that the probability argument works against the hallucination theory, because it is highly improbable that all of those disciples would have had the exact same hallucination, and that it made them all willing to die for what they believed that hallucination was telling them. So yeah, if one prefers the hallucination or the probability argument, then I think that argument works against him. But that's not necessarily my argument. Like I said, my argument is not it's improbable. My argument is, where's your evidence? Please give me the evidence. If you don't give me evidence, then why should I take it seriously?
Okay. And again, I'm sorry. I hope you don't mind me playing devil's advocate. Like, I'm trying to speak for Juan because he's not here.
I don't mind.
Okay, so me and you are philosophers. We've got some training in that department, whether formal or informal. Now, in terms of the burden of proof, so since your main counter is not necessarily that it's improbable, his natural hypothesis, whatever it is, these bereavement hallucinations, What if so? There's a difference between a rebutting defeater, where he's saying no, they did have hallucinations. This rebuts your resurrection, and now I have to prove they actually hallucinated. But what if one just submits this as an undercutting defeater? So I'm saying, well, look, I can't prove that they did have these hallucinations, but you can't prove that they didn't have it. And I'm just submitting this as an undercutting defeater to undercut your justification for believing it. Wouldn't that be a valid response, kind of thing, to submit an equally probable defeater?
Yeah, yeah, and I understand what you're saying, and I think we talked about that a little bit during the debate. And the basic point that I made about that was that if they were hallucinating, then there would be certain implications that would follow from the fact that they were hallucinating. And I don't, it would take a long time to go into all the details about that. But one of the implications of the hallucination theory is that if someone that it's hard to explain how a hallucination can actually give someone such unbelievable certainty that they're willing to die for the claim they're making. The claim that was caused by a hallucination. So a claim is caused by hallucination. They hallucinate. They're convinced that it's true, and now they're willing to die for it. And I think that is an extremely problematic implication, because when somebody is hallucinating, I would argue that there was always going to be some doubt. If I hallucinated that I had a conversation with George Washington 2 hours ago, am I going to die for that claim? I'm going to say, did I really have a conversation with George Washington? And whenever you hallucinate, you don't come up with corroborating evidence. You don't come up with corroborating witnesses. The whole idea of corroborating witnesses is just plastered all over the Gospels and the book of Acts. And hallucination is not about corroborating witnesses. You don't say, hey, somebody else is convinced of this also. And if it really was a hallucination, are they going to sit there and say, hey, that guy saw it also? This is where he was. This is what time of day it was. And here are these other people who saw the same thing. And we're all having the same hallucination. And we're presenting ourselves as corroborating witnesses to something that we hallucinated, something that, and whenever someone hallucinates about something, and they're in a mental institution, for example, and they're hallucinating, do they ever appeal to other eyewitnesses when they're hallucinating? No, they're convinced that the hallucination is actually gave them the truth, and they don't appeal to anybody else. All they say is, I saw that rat in the corner over there. I had a great grandmother who spent time in a mental institution near the end of her life, and the family members would visit her, and during the conversation, she'd be sitting in her bed, and she'd say, watch that rat. There's a rat in the corner over there. And she didn't say, hey, somebody else saw that rat also. Do you guys see that rat? She didn't say that. She thought she saw a rat in the corner of her room, and she didn't appeal to anybody else. She simply claimed that it was true because she thought it was true, because she was hallucinating. People who are hallucinating don't rely on corroborating evidence, and they don't go around telling people, hey, I saw this, and they don't say, we are witnesses of these things. People who hallucinate don't talk like that.
Yeah, fair enough. Great point. So, yeah, like I said, I think the hallucination hypothesis is an improbable, natural option for the skeptics to go. It's not equally probable as an explanation.
Yeah.
Therefore, it fails even as an undercutting defeater kind of thing. So,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, There was one point, if you don't mind, Juan's argument. So I want to team up with you against Juan now. But I do see we do have a good question from a skeptic, Brian Bedore, that's kind of geared towards you. About your first premise about Saint Peter. If you think that's a good question, if you want to address that, or no.
Sure. Yeah. St. Peter indicated willingness to die before denying Jesus, but St. Peter did deny Jesus. St. Peter talked the talk, but didn't walk the walk. Were the apostles able to walk the walk, martyred? And so let me take the second question first, because I think there's 2 points being made here, I think. And if I'm misunderstanding this, then Brian can certainly correct me. Sometimes I make mistakes. I'm not always accurate, not always right. So were the apostles able to walk the walk? Were they martyred? And so I take that question to mean, were they martyred? And my answer is twofold. First of all, the issue is not whether they were martyred. The issue is whether they were willing to be martyred. And if they were willing to be martyred, then yes, they were able to walk the walk because they were willing to be martyred. They were beaten and put in prison, and they were being warned by people who had the authority to put them to death, not to go out, not to continue to preach the resurrection. So I would say that yes, the apostles were definitely able to walk the walk. So let's take the first question. St. Peter indicated willingness to die for denying Jesus, but St. Peter did deny Jesus. Now, when he said that he was willing to die before denying Jesus, did he actually have a post-resurrection experience at that point? The answer is no. So where Peter was coming from when he said that, he was coming from a place of zeal, conviction, but not from a place of knowledge. Okay, let me repeat that. He was coming from a place of zeal, not from a place of knowledge, not from a place where he had corroborating, verifiable evidence that Jesus Christ had risen from the dead. He was saying, I'm willing to die before I'll deny you. He was talking to Jesus before the crucifixion and resurrection. And he was convinced that Jesus was who he claimed to be. But that conviction was subjective at that point. After the resurrection, the knowledge and evidence that Peter had for the resurrection was objective rather than subjective. So I think that's a distinction that would need to be made in order to address that first point. So Dale, tell me if I've gone off the rails.
Yeah, I think the only okay. So even if just one thing I'll add, let's grant for the sake his premise here. Let's say Peter was sincerely willing to die before Jesus, and that obviously, despite that, and he had knowledge Jesus was the Messiah because he witnessed the miracles. Let's just grant that for Brian's question. I don't think this disproves Phil's premise one about psychological certainty and that sort of thing, because when Peter denied Jesus before the Jews, he wasn't convinced, oh, Jesus is false kind of thing, and that's why he's denying. He was falsely denying him. He was convinced Jesus was the Messiah, but out of fear, he was saying something he didn't really believe. So even if I grant everything you're talking about the willingness, and granting Peter did have objective knowledge that Jesus was the Messiah from witnessing the miracles, it doesn't falsify Phil's premise, because he wasn't convinced when he was denying Jesus. He wasn't convinced Jesus was false. He was just saying that out of fear. Yeah, that's my response to that.
Yeah, I was making a little bit of a hedging argument, but yeah, you're making the stronger argument is a good move there, Dale. I think that's spot on. Because my argument is not, if somebody is willing to die for something, then it is therefore necessarily true. That's not my argument. My argument is that if someone is willing to die for something that they know is false, then then there's an epistemic disconnect there. And so that's why I'm saying that unless someone is insane, it's impossible to be convinced that something is true that you know is false. And that wasn't the case with Peter, as you pointed out there, Dale. So people will come to me and say, well, there are Muslims out there who are willing to die they're willing to die a martyr's death because of the jihad imperative in Islam. And they're willing to die for their claims about Allah and Muhammad and all those kinds of things. So doesn't that prove that all their claims are true and all their beliefs are true? And the answer is no. It's not just that they're willing to die for something. It's just that are they willing to die for something that they know isn't true? The people who are convinced of the claims of Islam, they don't know that they're false. They do believe that they're true, and so they're willing to die for them. And none of that has any bearing on whether it's true or false. So I hope that helps.
Awesome. All right. So I want to play Juan's first argument was something that really hit home with me, and I want us to go over it. And if you want to, actually, because I'm taking over and this is your show, I'm a guest. So it's based on do you have something else you'd rather discuss first? Or I was thinking of the resurrection is prima facie improbable, the sort of the typical atheist thing. So
yeah, I just put Juan's arguments up on the screen there.
Yeah, so I was very interested in the first one, and in fact, I have a short, like 1 minute or 2 minute video clip of Juan in the debate. The aspect I'd like to respond to there, because I think his take on this is totally false. So, can I share that clip?
Sure.
All right. So I'm going to be sharing my screen. Just ignore the echo until after the clip.
Well, I'm going to mute myself after I start this.
Okay. And
reference class problem. And it's, for example, if you're going to do a frequentist approach to probability, you have to pick the right reference class. And what some atheists do is that they look at the wrong reference class. For example, they look people who have died, how many of those have resurrected, right? I think that's the wrong reference class, because what the Christian is not saying is like that all the people who die has some probability of resurrecting, right? But I think the right reference class will be stories, ancient stories with supernatural elements. And if we look at all the stories we have with supernatural elements, we see how many of these are because they have myths or legend or someone lied, right? And how many of these are true. And the problem is that the ones that are true is almost zero, right? There are zero confirmed cases of this. So it will be extremely rare, right? So if we have a story, and especially an ancient story from this superstitious age, I could say there are just so many legends, so many myths, and we look at so many of these documents, and so many of them are myths that probably this one is also a myth. It's like a part of the group, right?
Okay, so hopefully we're back. So yeah, so as you can see, Juan's making kind of the typical atheist argument that a miracle, any miracle, the prior probability of that, the plausibility of that is so low. And the thing I like about Juan, though, is that he is giving a nuanced approach, whereas most atheists will say, well, how many billions of human beings have existed and none of them have risen from the dead or something like that. So therefore, there's a 1 out of 10 billion chance that God would have risen Jesus from the dead. Juan recognizes that's a fallacious argument. That's the wrong reference class. But what I'd like to discuss with you, Phil, is he suggests what he thinks the proper reference class is. And he says these are supernatural stories or narratives or accounts. And he says of all the supernatural miracle stories out there, most of them are false, you know, probably millions or whatever the number is. So, and he's like, the number of confirmed ones. So this is kind of a different one. He's like, the prior probability that the resurrection would be true, as opposed to just another myth like all of them, is very low. So his reference class is the stories versus the number of confirmed ones out there. And he says, you know, there's like a 1 out of a million chance that a resurrection miracle wouldn't just be another myth. Yeah, what's your take on that kind of argument? Because I know what I'm going to say about it.
Yeah, well, if I understand your question correctly, I think that the answer is in what we discussed during the debate, and that is that an improbable element to a story does not, because our prior ideology treats something as improbable, does not count as historical evidence. That's a philosophical bias and a philosophical predisposition against the probability of a given historical account is not a valid historical methodology. In other words, we don't judge whether something is true because our worldview tells us that it's improbable. That's not how history works. Historiography works in such a way that you examine the evidence and you set your personal bias aside, and you look at whether the evidence actually hangs together and is actually valid. If the evidence is valid and conclusive, then you can't refuse to accept the conclusion just because you have a philosophical or probability bias against it. You know, it's simply not a valid historical means and methodology for investigation.
Fair enough. Yeah, and I think my take on this is, yeah, it is, again, this is the wrong reference class. So in the first place, Juan was inconsistent there, right? Because he was comparing unconfirmed stories being false, miracle stories being false or myths, versus confirmed miracle stories. That doesn't matter. It just matters miracle stories. What are the odds this miracle story is true? Whether confirmed evidentially or not doesn't matter for his reference class that he's using. It would just be, you know, you could hypothetically say it would probably be how many miracles are in the Bible. We can assume all those are true. So maybe 300, 400 or something like that. I have no idea, but it's high, right? 400 divided by how many miracle claim stories are out there in the world. Let's say 10,000, just as a low estimate, because a lot of religions don't have miracle claims, right, and stuff like that to begin with. So let's say, for the sake of argument, it's like 200 divided by 10,000. Well, that's still very low. But the problem is Juan has still got the wrong reference class, because it doesn't matter how many false counterfeit myths are out there. That has no bearing on whether the miracles of Christianity would be true, or whether God would be sufficiently motivated to perform a miracle for one religion over another. So it's still in the wrong reference class. If we want to get the prior probability, there is this equation called the theory. I called it the Jeffrey conditionalization formula. Lydia McGrew has corrected me. So that the actual name of that, the total theory, the theory of total probability theorem. And so that's you basically, what's the probability that God exists, right? A God who's defined as a real maximum great being. He has the ability to perform the miracle and has all the features, whatever, right, that are necessary for him to do this resurrection miracle that we're assessing, times the probability that God would be sufficiently motivated to do that miracle. And I think there's great evidence proving that such a God exists, and that we can debate that. I know Juan would dispute me as an atheist, but we could get into those details. But let's say, for the sake of argument, it's 100%. Say the atheist grants me that such a God does exist. We would have this. Well, what's the probability that God would be motivated to do it in this specific instance? And that's just a black box to us as humans. Like, how can we a priori, before looking at the evidence, judge whether get into God's divine psychology and say, oh yeah, he would have been motivated in this case to raise Jesus from the dead versus not? I just don't think we can evaluate that and stuff like that. So that's my thing. And as to whether frequentist type arguments would affect the probability, is there background knowledge that might lower it? Some Christians say yes and stuff. So Lydia McGrew said that she thinks that what you should do is compare the probability that God would have been motivated to do the resurrection or a miracle for Christianity versus all the occasions where he had an opportunity to do a miracle authenticating Christianity, but he didn't do it. Right. So she pictures like a monk or a missionary trying to say, like, Christianity is true, I can prove it, fire will fall from heaven, and he points up to the heaven and nothing happens. So she'll say, there's so many occasions like that where Christians want to prove Christianity specifically with a miracle, and miracles don't happen. So she would say it's low on that basis. And I'm still a little bit skeptical on that, but I think that's a closer reference class than what Juan was suggesting. Just take all the myths out there as though those matter or something. But what's your take, Phil? Am I talking nonsense here, or do I make some sense?
No, I think it makes sense. My approach was just very simple. And my approach was that there are a lot of things that are improbable that happen every day. And so the fact that something is improbable doesn't mean that it didn't happen. And I use the analogy of meeting my wife. It was improbable that I actually met her and married her. But it was improbable, but it still happened. And so somebody can't say, no, you didn't meet your wife and you didn't marry her because that was so improbable that out of all the millions of people in the world, you actually were to meet her, and that you guys got married. And I'm going to say, well, your argument that it was improbable that I met my wife and married her, it fails because I met my wife and married her. It happened. And so improbable things happen all the time. And I also mentioned to Juan during the debate that if you say the resurrection Jesus probably did not rise from the dead, I would agree with that. Jesus probably did not rise from the dead. And all I'm doing is I'm simply acknowledging that the resurrection is improbable. But I can say Jesus probably didn't rise from the dead, and Jesus did rise from the dead, and both of those can be true. They don't contradict each other. So I think I have kind of like a simpler approach to it than that.
Yeah, I like your answer kind of thing. Although I would say in the context of Bayes' theorem, right? We know, for example, what's the prior probability, kind of similar to you meeting your wife. Any specific event is highly, highly unlikely, right? Like the odds of my winning the lottery, that prior probability is very low. It's 1 out of 10 million, let's just say, for the sake of argument. But that's why we need Bayes' theorem. Probability calculus says we can't just be lazy like David Hume and calculate that one factor. There's an entire equation. We also have to, what's the prior probability that the hypothesis would be false? That, the news reported this lottery number, given this was not the winning lottery number. And that's even more improbable relative to somebody getting the right one, right? So you have to compare that ratio. And that's even before we get into the question of the specific evidence supporting the resurrection or that I won the lottery or whatever, right? So That's
Right.
the ticket that a lot of skeptics neglect, is they neglect that other aspect of the ratio for the prior probability, and they just look at the improbability of the hypothesis without looking at, well, what's the improbability that the hypothesis is false. And
Right.
that's how you overcome these examples. Yeah. Yeah.
And the lottery analogy is actually better than my marriage analogy, because it is unbelievably improbable that any one particular individual will win the lottery. But people have won the lottery. There was a winner of the Colorado lottery several times in the last few years, and they won millions of dollars in many cases. But it was extremely improbable for them to win the lottery. The chances were astronomically against them winning the lottery, but they still won the lottery. And so if you were to approach them and say, "Hey, you didn't win the lottery," and they would say, "What makes you say that?" I say, "Well, because it was unbelievably improbable that you would have won the lottery. So I don't think you won it." And the person would say, "Well, I won the lottery. I can give you evidence that I won the lottery." And that is the whole point. If someone says, "You didn't win the lottery because it's improbable," and somebody else says, "But I won the lottery," then the first person should say, "Well, then what's your evidence?" And the person that won the lottery can give them evidence that they won the lottery. And if that evidence is not just convincing, but if that evidence is sound and conclusive, people can prove that they won the lottery. And if that's the case, then the evidence overrides the improbability. And that was my whole point in the debate with Juan. And what I mentioned to Juan several times was, improbability is not evidence. Likelihood is not evidence. And you cannot come to any kind of conclusion on the basis of probability. You simply can't. And so, in the same way that the person who won the lottery could provide evidence that they won the lottery, the disciples provided evidence that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. And they didn't say, "Hey, I know this is improbable, but let me tell you how it's possible that he rose from the dead, and I'm going to meet you on your turf, and I'm going to talk about probabilities here." The disciples never did that. The disciples never argued with anybody about probability. They offered eyewitness evidence. And that is the huge difference here. And that's one reason why I think that Juan's first premise is invalid. It may be improbable, but that doesn't mean anything. Didn't mean it didn't happen.
Yeah. Yeah. So this was an aspect where I disagreed with you a bit. But I've been thinking about it because I've been sort of going through a personal thing with Lydia McGrew and Dr. Jonathan McClatchy, who've been helping me on this prior probability issue, and stuff like that. But so, okay, so let me say it this way. So from a technical logician standpoint, you can't just bracket out the prior probability. You have to factor it in when you're assessing the overall calculation and probability, right? So the evidence I may agree with you that it's so powerful. Doesn't matter how low the prior probability is, the evidence is so powerful it overwhelms it. Or there's also the prior probability that the hypothesis is false, and that may be so low that it itself overwhelms the prior probability of the hypothesis. So technically speaking, we do have to account for it. Now, to your point, where I agree with what you just said, and believe it or not, it was the atheist David Johnson who was the one talking me into what you're saying here. So basically, look, did anybody in the ancient world do a calculation? I mean, Bayes' theorem didn't exist until what, the late 1700s, when the probability calculus was invented. So it's not essential for coming to faith. And the way people came to faith was directly through the evidence. I don't know anybody who would have been doing prior probability equations and stuff like that. So basically, what I'm trying to say, I agree with Phil that people can be warranted in light of the Holy Spirit and God ensuring that they are arriving at the truth and stuff like that, even if they don't know how to do this calculation and do the proper, ratios and all this stuff in the formula, you can still be warranted just by being presented with the evidence and that sort of thing. Does that make sense? What I'm trying to say there, Phil? Or I know I'm sort of speaking out of both sides of my mouth. Like I don't want to say, yeah, it's proper. Just ignore if the prior probabilities are inconvenient, just ignore them, kind of thing. If you know what you're doing, you've got to deal with them, technically speaking. But at the same time, God, for people that aren't mathematical astute and stuff, they don't know about Bayes' theorem, they have no idea how to use it properly, they can still be warranted without that stuff just by being presented with the evidence, as you said.
Yeah. Well, I think for the average Christian, I don't think the average Christian needs to even consider probability. I think most Christians who want to go beyond just blind faith, and that's a lot of Christians. A lot of Christians are not content to just believe something on blind faith. Many Christians want to have the evidence. And if a Christian came to me and said, "Phil, I don't want to believe in the resurrection on blind faith just because the Bible says so, just because my pastor told me, just because my Christian friend told me," then I would say, "All right, then what you need to do is examine the evidence for yourself." And I would not tell them that they should try to address the problem of improbability, because I don't think they need to. I think that all we need to do is examine the evidence. Either the evidence succeeds or it fails, period. And if the evidence succeeds, then probability is irrelevant. And that's why I don't even consider probability in the first place. When I'm presented with evidence that something is true, I don't sit down and wonder whether or not it's probably true. All I care about is it true or isn't it true? And the only way that I can tell whether something is true or false is by the evidence. The probability will not get me any closer to understanding or knowing that something is true. So that's kind of why I don't really. That's why I dismiss this argument, because the argument fails to give us any information about whether the resurrection occurred or not. And I dismiss it because probability is not evidence. That's my primary principle that I wanted to get across during the debate. And so that's kind of where things stand as far as I'm concerned. So if someone wants to address the idea of probability, I wouldn't try to discourage them, but I would just try to put it in perspective for them. I could say, you might study this issue and you might actually come to the conclusion that the evidence, or that not the evidence, that the resurrection of Christ was unbelievably improbable. And you might learn something in the process, and you might actually discover how improbable the evidence, or the improbable of the resurrection really was. But the next thing I would tell them is, but it doesn't matter. The improbability of the resurrection could be astronomical. It still doesn't matter, because the only thing that matters is the evidence. And probability is not evidence. Improbability is not evidence that something is false. Probability is not evidence that it's true. It's simply irrelevant. That's kind of my whole posture toward that.
Okay. Yeah. So we do have a disagreement on that, because I think people inherently think probabilistically, whether they're not consciously aware of it, stuff like that. But I think they're all using Bayes' theorem and just don't know it. And that's why I think, like, probabilities, there's different types of probabilities, but in terms of the probabilities that we're talking about here, subjective things, it's basically our assessment of our degree of credence for a given notion, Jesus rose from the dead, or whatever the hypothesis is, given a certain set of evidence. So I think that the probabilities are linked, and that it is possible for people to have differing degrees of knowledge that, okay, this is true, or I think I disbelieve this, but I'm not absolutely certain, and stuff like that. And so I do think probability is more relevant. It's not irrelevant, as you're saying, kind of thing. But if you're talking about, like, oh, well, by probability, are you meaning like everybody has to sit down with Bayes' theorem and do out the calculations and the maths like I did and all this stuff? Of course not. No, that I admit can be and is irrelevant for most people on the planet and stuff like that. But I do think that deep down they are thinking probabilistically and even using Bayes' theorem, but even though they've never heard of it and have no clue what it is, they are looking at the totality of the evidence and weighing the factors for and against in their head and saying, yeah, I'm pretty sure this is true, so I believe it. Or maybe in some cases they are absolutely certain. Like maybe you would say, I'm 100%. I've got, if I have to put a number to it, I'm absolutely certain Christianity is true, or something like that. So does that make sense?
Yeah.
What I'm saying? Yeah.
Well, it may be true that majority of people think probabilistically, and my reply to that is, well, no one's perfect. We may think probabilistically, and by the way, I believe that if I walk outside and get in my Durango, I believe that it will start. And so probability is the basis for my belief. But I don't know that it's going to start. I just believe that it will. And if I go downstairs and I go outside and I get in my Durango and I put the key in and start it up, and it actually starts, then my belief will have been vindicated. And I will know at that point that my belief was true. But I didn't know that it was true. And so when you say people think probabilistically, I would frame that as people think probabilistically and when they're forming their beliefs. But I think it's a mistake for people to think probabilistically when they're trying to arrive at knowledge, because probability never yields knowledge. It can only reinforce a belief. That's all it can do. It can't get you all the way to knowledge. The only thing that can get you all the way to knowledge is analytic or empirical evidence. And none of those things have anything to do with probability. So I don't want to spend too much more time on that. There are other things that I want to talk about.
Sure. Yeah,
but
cool.
And real quickly, I just want to put this comment up here. It says, Joe asks if I can tie a bowline knot. I'm not aware if I can because it has been years since I did it. So I take a rope and tie a bowline. I knew how to tie it even though I wasn't aware. Okay, so what he's trying to do is he's trying to make the point that knowledge can be subconscious. And my only reply to that is that you're equivocating between knowledge and skill. So you know how to tie a bowline because you have muscle memory and because you have knowledge that you forgot you had. That doesn't mean that it's subconscious. So that argument doesn't actually defeat the idea that knowledge that subconscious knowledge is not true knowledge. So, but I wanted to go on to the next argument that Juan made, and he made the argument number 2 that the Gospels are anonymous, and therefore the resurrection did not occur. And unless I'm missing something, I don't see how you get from a historical account is anonymous, therefore the facts that it relates are false. There's no argument there. There is a complete disconnect there. That is a fallacy of relevance. And so I don't think that the idea that the Gospels are anonymous really proves anything. It doesn't disprove anything. Because, Dale, are you aware of the percentage of how much of the history that we have comes from anonymous sources?
How much of the history, like just the documents you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, we have a vast wealth of historical knowledge accessible to human beings based on historical research and based on historiography and based on the science of history. How much of that historical knowledge comes from sources that are anonymous?
Yeah. So the short answer is, yeah, I don't have any idea. But I would probably want to challenge, because first of all, I don't think the Gospels were anonymous. It depends what Juan's meaning by anonymous, and I think I would mean something different by it. So in that sense, like,
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
Well, his argument is that the unless the author of a given historical account can be identified and verified, that historical account is not reliable. I think that's basically his argument.
Okay.
The Gospels are anonymous. In other words, we don't know who wrote them. And so since we don't know who wrote them, then we have to dismiss them as being any kind of reliable evidence for the resurrection.
Yeah, see, so that's where there's confusion. So number one, on Juan's part, right? Because he's saying, number one, that they are anonymous in the sense that, okay, it's not explicitly stated, hey, I'm John, I'm the author of this thing. And number two, it's anonymous from the perspective of us as moderns living 2,000 years later. And I just think that's, who cares? They were not anonymous, and we can prove this. And I do say I have notes in my thing. So you were correct. You mentioned the internal evidence test, and I was going to mention that, right, where we can prove this is eyewitness testimony. For example, Luke mentions the audience who would have read Acts, Theophilus, and that, who readily knew who the author was, that he wasn't anonymous to them. So
right.
Just because it's anonymous for us, from an explicit, hey, I don't see Luke saying, hey, I'm the guy who wrote this, my name's Luke, or something like that, that doesn't qualify as being anonymous to me. So in that sense, under Juan's definition, it's totally irrelevant, as you say. Yeah, over to you.
Right. And my argument is that even if I were to grant that we don't know who wrote the Gospels, I think we do. We know that Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke, even though it doesn't have his signature on it. But even if I were to grant that we don't know who the author of a given gospel is, that has absolutely no bearing on the reliability of that historical account. So, I just think that was such a weak argument that I would just kind of recommend that one kind of refrain from using that argument, because I don't think it's supporting his case. And I think the fact that he's making that argument, I think that can work against him instead of work in his favor. So I would recommend that he drop that argument, because it's completely irrelevant. And the reason that I ask about how much of our world history comes from anonymous sources, the point that I was making is that if the idea that historical anonymity of authorship, if that destroys the reliability of history, then it would destroy the reliability of, I think, probably the majority of what we know of the historical knowledge that we have as human beings in this world. If that was the criteria for historical reliability, then we would have to throw out all sorts of knowledge of history. And if that's the case, and I don't think that either Juan or an atheist that might present this argument, I don't think that they are ready to throw out what could be the majority of our knowledge of world history, because it doesn't satisfy the criteria that Juan is setting up here. So that's the reason why I made that comment. And that's the reason why I don't think that Juan should actually make that argument. I don't think Juan. Let's say that the historical account of Socrates drinking hemlock is written by an anonymous source. We don't know who wrote that history. Does that mean that we should doubt that Socrates drank the hemlock? No. And I don't think that Juan or anybody else, especially any atheist, is willing or ready to throw out the historical accounts about Socrates drinking hemlock simply because it doesn't pass their personal test of non-anonymity. So you can give me a quick comment on that, and then we'll go on.
Yeah, so I mostly it's tough because I mostly concur with you about this being kind of a flop argument. There is someone, user asks, are you both Christian or atheist? So me and Phil were both Christians. I've been trying my best since Juan's not here to represent the atheists. I've been trying to come up with plausible pushbacks and stuff like that. So hopefully I've been doing a good job as an atheist fill in there, Phil. But if I were to try my best in terms of the anonymous thing, so it is clearly relevant in some sense in that, well, yeah, like if we're not saying it's if we can't prove that it's one of the authors, like John, the son of Zebedee, who wrote it, or whoever the gospel is, Luke or something like that, it might be relevant or it might not be. And this is where Phil's saying, well, we've got to look at the evidence for, source criticism, for example. Who cares? For example, I don't believe John was written by John, the son of Zebedee. I think it was John the Elder. I go for Richard Bauckham's view. But as Lydia McGrew argues, it doesn't matter which is the John. Let's pretend we don't know. I can still prove it's an eyewitness who wrote it, and therefore there's reliability. So it's based on independent arguments for the source being an eyewitness that what matters. Likewise with Luke and Acts. Let's pretend we can't prove Luke wrote those. It's anonymous. But there's still, Craig Keener gives us good evidence independently to prove whoever it was, he was a companion of the Apostle Paul. And he would have been with Paul in these situations, and therefore that confers historical reliability on some of these accounts. And It gave him access to certain credible sources. So there are independent ways, even if we don't know who it is. And that's what Phil was saying there. Yeah.
Right. And not only that, not only would the author of the Gospel of Luke be a companion of Paul or the book of Acts, which either one, there are also a great many historical details about that culture and about the political environment in which they lived. Luke mentions all sorts of historical figures and historical events that can be independently verified. So there are so many details that Luke had that are correct in Luke's gospel, and we could come up with a list of what some of those details are. I've got those in some notes somewhere. If you can just give me a few seconds.
Sure. And while you're bringing that up, I'll just add to what I'm saying here. The last point, let's pretend what Phil and I just said is totally out to lunch. Let's pretend these gospels, they're not only anonymous, they're generally unreliable as a worst case scenario. Even there, Gary Habermas, Craig Keener, Michael Kona, they mentioned these and utilize these criteria of authenticity whereby we can prove certain particular facts, even assuming a worst case that it's not based on eyewitness sources. I can still prove there was an empty tomb or that the resurrection appearances took place or something like that. So yeah, I just really think this argument doesn't falsify the resurrection hypothesis, no matter which option you go for, kind of thing. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I've got my notes here. I a long time ago, I don't know where I came up with this, but some of the things that Luke gets right about the gospel is Herod the Great as king of Judea, the division of Herod's kingdom, Pontius Pilate as prefect of Judea. Archaeology confirms that Pontius Pilate was the prefect of Judea, the correct use of Roman and local titles, and also the census under Augustus, that is also confirmed by external history. The awareness of imperial chronology is something else that Luke is dead accurate on, and so that is that has a great deal to do with the test of historicity, and those facts that Luke got right are strong evidence that this is historically reliable. It's not the only evidence, but it's part of the cumulative evidence, and it's part of the internal evidence test. And those would all count, even if we didn't know who wrote that gospel. So again, this anonymity argument, I think that Juan and I think that atheists who use it, I think you need to drop it. So. But I want to move on here, unless there's something else another point you wanted to make about that, Dale.
No, I think we covered it pretty good.
Okay.
Yeah.
We'll wrap this up here pretty quickly. I don't want to take too much more time. We're already past the 2-hour mark. But Juan's third argument is the Gospels contain contradictions. And now that has a little bit more weight than the anonymity argument, because one of the tests in the internal evidence test is, does the account contradict itself? So I think that does need to be taken into consideration. And my argument during the debate was that the Gospels might contain contradictions, but that doesn't mean that Jesus Christ did not rise from the dead. That doesn't mean that one historical fact that exists in those historical accounts is false. But the fact that the Gospels contain contradictions, and that the historical account contradicts itself, that can diminish the reliability. I think in general, it can diminish the reliability of that historical account. But the question is, does that diminish the reliability of its primary thesis? And that primary thesis is Jesus Christ rose from the dead, and there is enough evidence that it's a reliable conclusion, even though there may be contradictions on some of the details, and those details are not central to the thesis that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. And that's why I don't think that the contradictions that might be in the Gospels, and I don't think there are any contradictions in the Gospels, but let's just assume that there are. I don't think those contradictions rise to the level of Jesus Christ rose from the dead. Jesus Christ did not rise from the dead. In other words, there's no contradictory statement in the Gospels that says, "Hey, Jesus didn't rise from the dead. This is all a hoax." And so that kind of contradiction is a central contradiction to the main thesis. And if that's the case, then I would take that argument more seriously. But the contradictions in the Gospels, the alleged contradictions in the Gospels, I should say, they're about minor details that really don't have that much to do with the central thesis. And the other side of that coin is, I don't think there are contradictions in the Bible or in the Gospels. I think that the apparent contradictions are only apparent and that they are not real. And the longest chapter in my recent book, Deconstructing Junk Theology, deals with the alleged contradictions in the Bible in general, but in the Gospels in particular. And I think that the accusation of contradictions is a false accusation. I think that all those contradictions can be resolved, or those apparent contradictions can be resolved. And so that argument relies on whether or not they are true contradictions. And if you can't establish that they are true contradictions, then the argument fails.
Yeah, so you'll be happy to know Juan just commented. He is still in the audience, saying he read Michael Kona's book on contradictions. So that I'll just say this. So in terms of Juan's specific examples, I was a guest on his channel where I specifically addressed Judas and the alleged contradiction there, as well as this issue of the angels. And to his point, the way I responded is I gave three responses for each alleged contradiction. So I said, number one, let's just assume it's an error. Is that a problem for proving the resurrection? And I said, no, it doesn't matter. Even if this is an error, we can still prove the resurrection happened on the basis of independent evidence for the facts we're using. But option number two, the harmonization thing, the route Phil Bair went, there a lot of times there are ways to harmonize the accounts, and Lydia McGrew has done great work on that. There are certain undesigned coincidences and that sort of thing. But to what Juan's talking about here, a third option, and this is one of the routes I used for the angel example, is there are these ancient literary devices that the gospel writers could use, and that, yes, they're not reflecting actual history in the sense that if you had a video camera, but they're not meant to. The ancient audience would know they're using a literary device. So, for example, the literary device of spotlighting was what's being used in terms of these accounts of the angels. One gospel writer is spotlighting one angel and focusing on that angel because that's the one that talked, and ignoring the other one. He's not saying there was only one angel. He's just focusing, and there was one angel and he said this. So that's not a provable contradiction. It's just a literary device of spotlighting on or focusing on something, right? So those are the three options, right? It's usually a literary device or there's some kind of harmonization. And in the event that there is an actual provable error, what significance? You have to ask, what significance does that have in falsifying the resurrection hypothesis proper? And so long as we can independently prove the resurrection, I don't care if there are 100 contradictions. It's irrelevant. These things aren't because they've been proven. So, yeah.
Right. Yep. And the other thing is that when people talk about contradictions in the Gospels and in contradictions in the Bible in general, most of the time, whenever I have heard people raise that objection, it usually turns out that those people don't know what a contradiction is. And what they call a contradiction is really not a contradiction. It's simply a variant. And one of the examples is the angels. And I love that. I love this whole spotlight term because it can help us form all sorts of analogies that are extremely helpful in this dialogue. And let's say that you're at a school play and there are 10 people on the stage, but the spotlight is on one person on the stage. And so when I observe the stage and I see the spotlight on that person is speaking, I can write down in my notes, on my notepad, there is one person on the stage. And is that proposition true? Yes, it is true. But let's consider another proposition. Is there only one person on the stage? And that proposition would be false. So the proposition there are 10 people on the stage right now is also true, and it does not contradict the proposition there is one person on that stage, because the fact that there are 10 people on that stage does not contradict the fact that there is one person on the stage. It's just that there is not only one person on the stage, but that's not the proposition. The proposition is very, very simple. The simple proposition is there's a person on that stage. And that correlates directly to the Gospels. There is an angel that rolled away that stone, and that angel is sitting on top of it, and that angel is speaking. So there's an angel there. I see an angel. There's one angel. And that does not contradict the fact that there are two angels. And so most people who talk about this idea of contradictions, sometimes they're not very well trained in the discipline of formal logic, and they don't really know what the strict definition of a contradiction is. And so I would point that out, and I would help people try to understand that and help them understand logic pretty much better. I think every Christian in the world should study formal logic, by the way. I think we should all become experts in logical thinking. Maybe not experts, but at least have minimal skills in logical thinking. And then we have another question: are you both Christian or atheist? And we are both Christians. And I don't know whether you might have mentioned that already, Dale. But
that's what I was saying. Like I'm Christian, but I'm trying my best to like bring some good atheistic pushback where it's appropriate to do so and stuff. So
yeah. Well, and for those of you who don't know us, Dale is just trying to make life difficult for me. That's really pretty much what he's doing.
Yeah, well, I'm comfortable. I know you know how to handle the atheist objections and stuff. So yeah, I don't think them.
Yeah, and that's, by the way, just as a general comment, that's one of the reasons why I like having Dale on the show, is because Dale challenges me. He doesn't let me get away with anything, and sometimes he'll push back, and sometimes he'll play devil's advocate, and that's good for me. I need someone to be able to challenge me like that, and not let everything just be so easy. So I appreciate you for that, Dale. Even though you're mistaken about all those things, I still appreciate the fact that your heart's in the right place. So.
I am curious for Juan, and also for user, assuming you're an atheist kind of thing. Let me know how I'm doing on that front, if I'm doing a good job representing when I do get the pushback and stuff. But yeah. So his fourth argument is the gospel contains unrealistic events. So that I see this as just sort of another thing. It's contradictions, but instead of internal contradictions, it's contradictions with external fact. Now, in my notes, I noted, I just had this note that, he gave the example of the releasing of Barabbas is unrealistic, or Jesus cleansing out the temple is unrealistic, that the Romans would have been on him in a second and would have stopped that from happening. And I noted quote unquote, Phil had no rebuttal in the debate to the unrealistic events due to lack of time. So yeah, I'm just curious, now that you have the time, is there anything you wanted to say about this argument? Because I don't think it was
actually, I did have a rebuttal for that, but it was I only had a rebuttal for one example. And the example was that Juan was telling us that the idea that Joseph of Arimathea was given custody of the body of Jesus and was able to bury it in his private tomb was unrealistic, because it would have been dangerous for him to provide any evidence that he was a disciple of Christ, or that he was sympathetic to his cause, or anything like that. And we did talk about Joseph of Arimathea, and I made the point that it is an invalid argument to say that it's unrealistic for Joseph, for that whole narrative of Joseph being given custody of the body and given the authority to bury it in his private garden, whatever it was. And that is because Joseph was an extremely wealthy man, and wealth means influence. And so it may have been dangerous for a Pharisee to be sympathetic to the cause of Christ, or to be sympathetic to wanting to bury him like a dignified human being instead of like a criminal. And in general, that may be true, but there are so many mitigating factors involved. And one of them is that Joseph was a disciple of Christ, and he was a secret disciple of Christ. And so Juan's point that it would have been dangerous is a valid point to an extent, because Juan was not aware of the fact that Joseph and Jesus actually had a conversation that is recorded as a historical event in the Gospel of John, which I think we can treat as historically reliable documents. And so in the Gospel of John, Joseph meets with Jesus, but they meet at nighttime. And Joseph didn't want people to know that he had that meeting with Jesus. And so it's not unrealistic for Joseph to have been a disciple or sympathetic. Now, when Joseph was given custody of the body and he was able to bury it, that might have been a red flag for the Sanhedrin, but there are two things, at least two things, that mitigate that problem. One of them is that Joseph was a wealthy member of the Sanhedrin, and wealth means clout, and so people might have had theological objections to something that Joseph of Arimathea might want to do, but a lot of times when they have theological objections, sometimes they don't necessarily give a whole lot of weight to those, and they don't give them full expression when challenging somebody that wealthy with that much influence and that much power that comes with that kind of wealth might be just as dangerous as Joseph admitting that he was a disciple of Christ at a Sanhedrin. So this whole unrealistic idea works both ways. It works in multiple directions and on multiple levels. It's not so simple. You can't simply just say, well, it would have been dangerous for Joseph to be a disciple of Christ. Therefore, none of those things that are claimed in the Gospels about what Joseph did with the body and how he played a role in Jesus' burial, and that he owned the tomb, and that he was buried not as a criminal but as a dignified human being. It doesn't prove any of those things are false. Not in any way. So I did actually rebut that argument, but I was only able to. You were right, Dale, that there was a limited amount of time, so I wasn't able to address the cleansing of the temple and the other things that Juan might have mentioned. But it's simply not true that the cleansing of a temple was unrealistic, or that it could not have occurred for various reasons. And I just don't think that the unrealistic event argument actually works. And another thing that Juan mentioned was that and I actually addressed this one as well. So I addressed two examples of his unrealistic event argument. The other example was Judas being hanged and then falling headlong into a field and having his intestines spilled out.
Oh,
and
no, that was an example of an internal contradiction.
Yeah. Okay.
But
all right. Never mind.
He gave me. If you want the other example, I took my two examples from the opening. So I think Juan didn't mention Joseph in the opening. That's why I was wrong and missed that. But his other example was the releasing of Barabbas. That's unrealistic, according to Bart Ehrman. He quotes Bart Ehrman saying that.
Yeah. Well, I have read several scholars who have told me that was a common practice in the ancient world, is to release a prisoner in exchange for a guilty verdict for prisoner number one. So release prisoner number two, and I will carry out this whatever the verdict is on prisoner number one. That happened quite often in the ancient world, and so to say that the release of Barabbas was improbable or unrealistic, I don't think that holds any water, because it was actually a known pattern that occurred in the ancient world. Unless I'm deluded, unless I'm hallucinating about those things that I read about, which I could be.
Fair enough. Yeah, I just, on the Joseph thing, I just wanted to say, in the first place, it's not, my take on that is it's not necessarily that they would infer he was a follower of Jesus just because he buried Jesus, because it's actually quite plausible, as Juan will know, and you're going to love this, Phil. Let me play I'm going to share my screen and play a quote, not from some Christian. We can't trust those Christians. From the atheist scholar, Dr. James Fedor, who Juan knows very well. what does he say about the plausibility of Joseph burying Jesus? Well, let's take a look at what he has to say in his most recent debate there. So is that popping up?
Okay, and how long is this? How long is this? Is that clip?
It's a couple minutes.
Okay, I'm going to take a break.
Huh? Oh, is it up?
Yeah, but I'm shared your audio, which I know you have to do. It's creating this echo.
Okay,
So what I was going to say is I'm going to take a break while you play this.
Okay.
And then memory distortions later on. So let me then talk about some of the details of the particular elements, and specifically why we should think these are plausible. And hopefully throughout the course of this debate, we can draw out some of these in more detail. So the idea in brief of the reburial is that we know that Jewish law said that the bodies crucified or other bodies should be removed from the cross before the Sabbath began, because that would be contamination of the holiness of the Sabbath. John mentions this, that the day of preparation, that the Sabbath was approaching. It was the day of preparation before the Sabbath. The tomb was nearby, so they laid Jesus there to get it all done before the Sabbath began. So that's a baseline plausibility for why the body was put there in the first place. The idea there is that it was placed there temporarily. It was always intended to be a temporary, not really burial, more of a storage for the duration of the Sabbath until it could be moved as soon as the Sabbath had ended, which was Saturday evening. The Gospels support this by indicating that the burial was rushed. So evening had already come. It was a preparation day, the day before the Sabbath. And so again, there's an indication there of a need to find a solution to the problem of what to do with Jesus's body quickly, and a nearby burial site would be suitable. Now, the other reason for why Jesus's body was placed in the Josephus tomb, was placed in the tomb according to this hypothesis, is that the Romans were also concerned about civil disorder. There'd already been almost been a riot when Jesus was convicted and sentenced, and so that they didn't want that to be repeated. A quiet, private burial site was desirable for this reason. And so the idea is that Jesus was placed temporarily in Joseph's tomb and the body removed as soon as possible, which was Saturday evening. And that's why on Sunday morning, when the women came to dress the body or finish dressing the body, the tomb was empty.
Okay. I'll stop sharing. All right. So as you can see, this is an atheist, and he's arguing for the reburial, James Tabor's reburial notion. But in the course of doing so, he's actually helping Christians by proving it's fully plausible that Joseph of Arimathea would have, at the very least initially, buried Jesus in his tomb. And that's consistent with our ancient historical knowledge of Jewish and Roman history. And there's nothing implausible about that. And Joseph wouldn't necessarily have been seen as a conspiring Christian or something like that. He wouldn't have been exposed. So again, me and Phil would disagree with this reburial nonsense, but even in James Fedor arguing for that, he's backing us up that Joseph of Arimathea buried Jesus in his tomb on that Friday after the crucifixion. And yeah, so I think that argues for the plausibility, and there you go.
Yep. Well, you did my work for me. Thank you.
Well, thank you to James. He did it for us, but
yeah.
All right, number 5.
Yeah, number 5. Historians did not mention the miracles of Jesus, and I think that if I remember right, I listened to most of the debate again to prep for this review, but I didn't get all the way through it, so I don't remember how I actually addressed this point. But the way that I would address it now is that, first of all, the fact that historians and I'm assuming he means secular historians, external evidence, external accounts, that the reason that the fact that historians or that external historians didn't mention the miracles of Jesus has no bearing on whether or not Jesus Christ rose from the dead. And so this is another one of those fallacies of relevance that I think that Juan should drop as far as his debating points is concerned. And the second reason that this argument fails is that historians did mention the miracles of Jesus. And those historians were Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or whoever wrote the Gospels. And I mentioned the fact that if there is a solid, researched series of historical accounts about the miracles of Jesus that has already been done, then that is the historical account. That is the historical evidence. And nobody else needs to duplicate that effort because it's already been done. And not only that, but what historians would mention the miracles of Jesus if they weren't in close proximity to all those events, if they didn't witness those events, if they didn't hear about those events until later, maybe they never caught wind of the idea that Jesus performed miracles. And if they did catch wind of that, maybe they didn't want to write about it because they would have been embarrassed to write an account of something miraculous when perhaps most people in their culture didn't believe in the miraculous, and they might have been afraid that they would have discredited themselves. I mean, in other words, there's a whole litany of possible reasons why historians didn't mention the miracles of Jesus. And so to rely on that as evidence against the resurrection, I think is extremely, extremely weak, if not a total failure. So tell me your thoughts, Dale.
I was desperately trying to find a paper I linked to by Dr. Tim McGrew, but yeah, basically this is one of the weaker arguments, along with number two, that, in my opinion, look, by which he means contemporary historians didn't mention the miracles of Jesus. But again, Tim McGrew has a great paper where there are three criteria for calibrating our proper expectations, whereby in the absence of evidence, maybe I should have searched for that, actually can be used to prove something. And none of these criteria are fulfilled in the case of Jesus's miracles. Number one, right. What contemporary historians, because that's what he specifies, actually lived in between 27 and 30 AD, who were writing at that time about miracles in Judea and stuff like that. So we had we have historians from decades later and stuff, right? Like, even if you include Greek historians like Thales and Phlegon, they didn't write their histories until much later, and they were not focused on Judea and that sort of thing, right? So yeah, the fact that Jesus was performing miracles, even if a Roman historian or a Greek historian contemporarily with Jesus heard of the miracles, would we expect him to care? Because as atheists like to tell us, there were lots of miracle men, Honai the circle drawer and stuff like that. So there's lots of reports, and reports are cheap in the ancient world. The historians didn't necessarily go and investigate every bit of gossip they heard unless they had occasion to do so. Like, they were writing a history and they had the money and the budget to go and travel to the places and interview people and stuff like that. But there were no records at the time of Jesus like that being written.
That speaks to my point of going to the effort, because it would have been a duplication of effort for some other historian outside of the gospel research circle to go in and try to duplicate that effort. It wouldn't have been productive. It wouldn't have been meaningful, and so historians, why would they care, and why would they want to go to the effort to do something that somebody else has already done? Now,
think about this. Just one thing to add. Think about this, Juan. Like, modern day, you love Richard Carrier, right? Richard Carrier talks all about these cargo cults that are so similar to the early Christian church, right? There are alleged miracle claims everywhere, and it's so much easier compared to 2,000 years ago for modern historians to go and investigate. But how many when's the last time I've never seen Dr. Bettany Hughes or Simon Schama investigating the miracle claims that they've heard about going on in Africa. They just don't care. There's whatever. It's not my business. I'm not going to look into it, right? So there are tons of miracle claims even today that modern historians are aware of and could investigate if they wanted to, much easier than Roman historians back in Jesus' day, but they don't. They don't care because they don't take it seriously. They just miracle claims are a dime a dozen. So if that's our situation today, same back then.
And also there's great risk in a historian writing about miracles. There's a great risk to their reputation, because if their surrounding culture doesn't believe in miracles, or if their fellow scholars don't believe in miracles, or if a great segment of their society doesn't believe in miracles, then they're going to get egg on their face if they write history that contains accounts of miracles. Now, it's not necessarily true of all of them. It's not true across the board, but there needs to be a motivation. History always has a motive, and some people find that fact uncomfortable, but there would have to be a motive for outboard historians to write about the miracles of Jesus, and that motive would have to outweigh the other motivations that those historians might have. And so it's extremely plausible that other historians would not want to actually write anything about the miracles of Jesus. And so it simply doesn't. It's simply another argument from silence. That because other historians didn't write about the miracles of Jesus, then we can conclude and we can use that as positive evidence that the miracles of Jesus didn't occur, or that the resurrection didn't occur. And there are times when the argument from silence is valid, but in this case, I think we can consider it invalid, because of the fact that we don't have silence. We have historical accounts and historical eyewitness testimony that has been written down, and it is well attested, and that history is in the Gospels, that the Gospels are the history of Jesus and the miracles of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus. To simply dismiss them because of the fact that one, they contain miraculous elements, and two, they were written by people who were biased in favor of who Jesus was, neither one of those work. And I don't know that we ever actually got to the idea of bias in historical accounts. But we could say something about it now, and that is that a lot of people will say, external historians did not write about the miracles of Jesus. And my argument is, well, we do have historians that wrote about the miracles of Jesus. They would push back on that, and they would say, but those historical accounts and those historians are unreliable because they're biased. And so we can't accept those historical accounts because of the bias of the author of those historical accounts. And the reason that argument fails is because there's no such thing as a historian that has no bias for some reason or another. And the other thing is that the fact that you can be psychologically biased and epistemologically objective all at the same time. And some people have a hard time with that. Some people have a hard time accepting that, but I can be psychologically biased that I own a Dodge Durango, but that doesn't mean that I don't have epistemological objectivity about the fact that I own a Dodge Durango. My bias is because of my objectivity. It's not the other way around. And so we don't use the bias of the evangelists as evidence for the reliability of their history. the reliability of their history was the cause of their bias. And you cannot simply take their bias by itself and conclude that it is therefore unreliable. How did they get that bias? That's the question. And in fact, I would argue that the bias of the evangelists who wrote the Gospels is actually further support for the reliability of those Gospels, the reliability of that historical account. Because if I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and I have a bias in favor of who he is and in favor of the fact that he was raised from the dead, then I'm going to be well motivated to write my history in such a way that I don't discredit it with errors. And so if I'm going to write a gospel, I'm going to make sure it's accurate, because if it's not, I'll get crucified. See what I did there? and so the bias of the apostles and the bias of the authors of the Gospels is not evidence against anything, and is simply irrelevant, or it may even actually be supporting evidence, because they wrote these with a motive involved. And that's, like I said, historians always have a motive. And the motive is very clear in the Gospels. They say Jesus did other things that weren't written in this book, and I imagine that the whole world wouldn't be able to contain all the books that would be written if everything that Jesus did were written down. But this was written so that you may know that he is the Son of God, and you may believe in him, and that by believing you might have life in his name. So he gave us his motive right there. It was very explicit in that gospel. And so it shouldn't surprise anyone that if someone is convinced of who Jesus is and that he rose from the dead, that they wouldn't be biased, and that it wouldn't be, it would be perfectly natural for them to write a historical account, because if they're that biased, they're going to want the world to know about all this. And if that's the case, then they're going to be motivated to write accurate history. If they write inaccurate history, it's going to work against them, and they know that. They know that very well. They're going to be very careful to make sure that their history is accurate, because if it isn't, then it's going to undermine the credibility of their account, and it's going to detract from the chances of people believing in Christ as the Messiah. So give me your thoughts, Dale.
Yeah. So I managed to find Tim McGrew's paper. It's called The Argument of Silence, and I'll post this up on my blog for this show in case Juan wants to see this. But I was looking for the specific quote. I hope this is it. But so here's how he ends in terms of the three criteria. So Tim McGrew says, I will close with a modest proposal for any atheist or skeptic wanting to make an argument from silence based on ancient history. Anyone who puts forward such an argument in historical inquiry should offer explicit arguments or proof for each of the three claims. So number one, the event or fact would almost certainly have come to the notice of the ancient author or historian in question. Okay, so we've kind of covered that. Number two, the author or historian would have recorded, or in some other clear fashion, given evidence of the fact had they noticed it. We've discussed that. But number three, the work or works in which this was done would have survived to the present era. So, for example, all of these miracles I could just say they were recorded in the Acts of Pontius Pilate, the official document, but that was lost to history. So actually, there were official Roman historians and government records of people there at the time who knew about Jesus' miracles and would have recorded them, but they've been lost to history. So in order, again, you would have to prove that there are no mentions of any of Jesus' miracles in any works that have been lost as well, in order to make this argument from silence succeed. So just to summarize, those are the three things. You have to prove that the historians would have noticed these events or facts, living all the way in Rome and hearing about some random Jewish man decades later. 2, that the historian would have recorded or in some clear fashion given evidence of this fact if they noticed it. And thirdly, that their work or works would have survived to the present era and would be noticed by contemporary scholars. So those are the 3 things you have to do in order to prove this argument from silence. And I think Juan fails on all 3.
Yeah.
Or the atheist making this argument. Yeah.
Yeah, Juan, you hear that? You're such a failure.
No, we all fail once in a while.
No,
Juan's
I'm just teasing. I'm just teasing Juan, and I feel like I can tease him because I compliment Juan so often that if I tease him, I think he knows that I'm not serious, that I'm not trying to discredit him, because the guy is so honest and so gentle and so genuine and so sincere that.
See, I just have to interrupt because it is so sickening, all these compliments that you give to Juan. I just have to roll my eyes. Come on, Phil. We're on Team Christian. It's us versus them. We've got to get this. Perhaps I'm mistaken, but I'm just kidding.
Juan. Yeah. We should be attacking their character, and we should be calling them evil and so on. Yeah. Exactly. We should launch all sorts of ad hominem attacks against him. Yeah, I shouldn't be friendly toward Juan. I should be hostile toward him, and I should be very disrespectful toward Juan.
That's the ticket.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think that it discredits people when they are so disrespectful toward those that disagree with them. And I always want to make 2 points. One is that I'm not always right. I could be wrong. And the second point is that someone like Juan has done his homework. He's serious about this, and he's not just shooting from the hip here. He's thought things through, and he is worth listening to. Juan, you are worth listening to, period. And I appreciate that, and I appreciate your personality traits that make it so enjoyable to interact with you. So I think, Juan, you would make a wonderful Christian. And so that's what I'm praying for. Hope you don't mind. But I also want to touch on something else that Juan is wrong about.
Before you do that, I'll say something good.
I'm so mean.
When I do like when you and he get together to do these debates, the clarity that both of you guys have. Like in your case, here are my 3 arguments. Here are the premises. In Juan's case, he doesn't put them in premise format, but like he lays it out. Here are the 5 arguments. Here are my reasoning for each of these arguments. So it's very clear and easy for the audience to follow. So that's another aspect I like when you guys do debates together. But back to the Juan bashing. So yeah.
Okay. All right. I'm gonna bash Juan a little bit more. And by the way, and this number 4, the gospel contains unrealistic events. That's almost borders on the fallacy of incredulity. And the fallacy of incredulity is it says this: I just can't believe that such and such an event would have taken place. And here are the reasons why I just can't believe that could be true. And that's the fallacy of incredulity. And this idea that the Gospels contain unrealistic events, it can be a little bit subjective. Now, I don't think that Juan is basing these things on pure subjectivity, because he does have historically correct context for some of these things. For example, he claims that it would have been dangerous for Joseph of Arimathea to admit that he was a Christian, or to make it public, or to make it known that he was a Christian, or that he was a follower, or that he was sympathetic to Christ, or whatever. Now, one can't say that without knowing something about that historical context. So Juan, like I said, and like I've said many times, Juan has done his homework. And so this unrealistic event argument is not completely subjective, and it's not totally an argument from personal incredulity, but it borders on the fallacy of incredulity in the sense that given what I know about the historical climate of the time, this is extremely unrealistic. And so that's not an argument from incredulity. The incredulity comes in when you dismiss the alternate explanations that make those things plausible as opposed to implausible. And so that's where I would press the point with Juan on that. Not that he hasn't done his homework, not that he's going to be completely subjective. It's that I think that sometimes he can be a little bit selective about what he bases his conclusion that something is realistic on, and what is not a good basis for it, because there are other factors that actually mitigate some of those points for him. So I hope that was clear. I hope that was clear as mud, that I wasn't rambling too much. But the other thing that we talked about during the debate was, I brought up the fact that we can have confidence in the miracles of Christ and in the resurrection because the miraculous and supernatural elements of the account appear early. They're not later accretions from a long time following the event. And the point that I made was that usually when there are supernatural elements to historical accounts, they usually appear later, and they're usually not relatively early. And Juan pushed back on that and said, no, there are some historical accounts from ancient times that do contain miraculous elements, and that those miraculous elements did occur early. And so we never really got a chance to explore that in very much detail, because I think we kind of ran out of time, and we just didn't have much of an opportunity to explore that any further. And so I wanted to talk about it now, because just the fact that a supernatural element in a historical account is early is not necessarily doesn't necessarily lend credence to just plain any old historical account, and therefore it shouldn't count as evidence for the resurrection. And that is that there's a difference. There's the early elements of supernatural accounts in some of these other historical narratives have a different purpose than what the resurrection and the miracle claims in the Gospels have. Christians don't argue the resurrection claims are early, therefore they're true. The argument is the resurrection claims are early, therefore certain explanations fail, especially late legendary accretion. And second, early secular miracle claims, they don't revive late legend theories. So pointing out that other cultures produced early supernatural stories does nothing to re-enable the claim that the resurrection narrative developed slowly over decades. The Christian claim targets a specific hypothesis and not all falsehood. And then the third point is that this comparison shifts the goalpost. Saying other earlier miracle claims exist quietly replaces the claim being answered. The issue is not whether early miracle claims can be false. Of course they can. The issue is whether the resurrection claims had time to evolve into legend. Earlier attestation still blocks that route. And then the fourth item I had in my notes here is early plus false does not equal early plus legendary. So many early pagan supernatural claims arise from immediate interpretation, political propaganda, or worldview expectations, and that's a different mechanism for slow mythological development. And showing that early false claims does exist does not show that the resurrection stories arose by legend. And then I also had the point in my notes that the resurrection claim remains early regardless. The dating of sources such as early creedal material and proclamation does not change because other early supernatural claims exist. One does not cancel out the other. So at most, the critic establishes that early claims require further evaluation, which Christians already grant. And then finally, the burden of explanation still stands. If the critic rejects the resurrection, they still must explain why resurrection belief appears immediately, publicly, and centrally rather than gradually. Early pagan miracle stories do not supply that explanation by themselves. And whenever there's a supernatural element in historical accounts that are secular, or that we would consider secular as opposed to Christian, whenever they occur for a different reason. They don't occur because they're trying to convince the reader that this person was supernatural. They occur because they're trying to lend credibility to some of the claims about that person, like that historical figure, that historical figure was a supernatural figure, and they don't appeal to evidence for those claims. And because the purpose is not to establish historical credibility, the purpose is to establish political clout and political credibility. And that's a quite different agenda. And so the fact that there are other supernatural claims in other accounts in history that appear early doesn't necessarily weaken the idea of the Christian claim, because they're in a different category altogether. So tell me what your thoughts are, Dale.
Yeah, nothing much to add about that, because I think I already spoke about that a little bit earlier on the prima facie improbable aspect. But yeah, there was one last thing, bit of feedback on your arguments that I realized I missed. So it's kind of out of thing, but I think it's important for your second argument. This comes from David Paulman. Again, he mentioned and noticed that your second argument was invalid. So, it's something to do with the logical structure. So you said premise 1, if the resurrection did not occur, then falsifying it in first century Jerusalem would have been easy. Premise 2, it was never falsified. Conclusion, therefore the resurrection occurred. And I noticed that. So that would be invalid. Just because you haven't falsified it doesn't mean that the resurrection did occur. Just like saying, if the resurrection occurred, then you should be able to prove it. It hasn't been proven, therefore the resurrection didn't occur. So that was the only other bit of feedback on your arguments that I think I missed, from David Paulman, saying that your second argument's invalid. I don't know. Does that make sense, what he was saying there?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I'm convinced that what he said detracts from the validity of the argument. The argument is, if the resurrection did not occur, falsifying in first century Jerusalem would have been trivial, and therefore it would have been falsified. That's really the better rendering of premise 1. If falsification was trivial, falsification would have occurred, and the reason for that is because there was an overwhelmingly powerful motive to falsify it. There was a political motive in Jerusalem on the part of the Romans and on the part of the Jews to falsify that claim. And if it was trivial to falsify the claim, then they would have falsified it because they had every motive to falsify it. That's probably so. The way that I structured the argument is probably a little bit incomplete.
Yeah.
And if you take it just the way that it's worded, I can see how that ambiguity might lead one to believe that the argument is invalid. But I should probably refine the argument to say, if the resurrection did not occur, falsifying in first Central Jerusalem would have been trivial, and then have a premise two that says that the triviality of falsification would have made the falsification a reality because of the strong motives that everyone, or that not everyone, but that a whole lot of groups would have had to falsify it. And I'm not stating it very clearly and very eloquently right now, but I'm just shooting from the hip.
Here's how. Yeah, let me share my screen because I think I got a good way of showing what you were intending to do. That basically there's an implicit premise and sub conclusion here. Am I sharing?
Yep.
Is that yeah? So okay, so full screen. Okay, so originally you have this. This was taken out. Come on now. So this was your argument as stated, right? And this is clearly invalid. The conclusion does not follow from the assumed truth of these premises. But I think what you're saying is, well, there's an implied premise. There's a sub-argument here where there's a hypothetical syllogism. So if the resurrection did not occur, then falsifying it in the first century would have been easy. If falsifying it was easy, then it would have been falsified, in fact. And then finally, it wasn't falsified, kind of thing. So something along those lines.
Right. Yep. And that's a great point. Yeah, that's a great point. I should have added that premise. It was kind of a hidden premise, and it shouldn't have been a hidden premise. So if falsifying it was easy, then it would have been falsified. How do we know that? Because the authorities at the time had a powerful motive to see it falsified. So if it was trivial to falsify it, and they had that powerful motive to falsify it, they would have taken advantage of how trivial it was to falsify it, and they would have falsified it.
Gotcha. Yeah. Yep. Yep. So that makes it valid. Did not occur. Then just adding in the sub conclusion, then it would have been falsified. Perfect. There you go. All right. So that solves that. Yeah. That's literally the only objections I think we covered on your arguments, and I think we covered all of Juan's 5 of his arguments. So yeah. I guess general thoughts just ending. We've already kind of said that I thought it was an interesting debate. I appreciated on your end, Phil, that you used non-standard arguments for the resurrection. You didn't go down the Gary Habermas, Mike Licona route. You attempted to make your own arguments, and you presented them in deductive form, which is great for the audience that wants to evaluate. You know, they can instantly see, is this valid? And are the premises sound, or are they deductively strong or not? And they get into that. And same with Juan's. His arguments were clear. He presented his reasons as being clear and stuff like that. So it was a debate that made it very easy for the audience to assess on their own. And I think that's the way forward. That's how we, you know, a lot of times in debates, people try to talk over other people's heads, and things get lost in the weeds, and it's hard to follow and stuff. So yeah. I really liked this formatting.
Yeah, and I appreciate David Paulman's input on that argument, because strictly speaking, the way that it was worded is probably could be considered invalid. But I would say it was invalid in its structure, not because it was logically imperfect, but because it was incomplete. So invalid because it's incomplete is different from invalid because it is invalid in its essence. And so the essence of the argument really wasn't fully expressed the way that I actually wrote the argument. So I wanted to keep it simple, and I think I probably kept it too simple because I made it incomplete the way that I actually worded it. So I appreciate David's input on that, and so he's done me a favor by helping me refine the arguments. I always I always appreciate input and I always appreciate feedback on something like that. And I should have caught the fact that that argument was incomplete ahead of time, but I didn't. So it's great to have Christian brothers who come alongside us and challenge us on those things. And so I appreciate that David did that. And I like David's work. I think he's got a lot to contribute, and he's very well read. And so he's not always well argued, but I'm not always well argued either. You know, we iron sharpens iron, and we're there to help each other. So thank you, David Paulman, for that, and also I appreciate your feedback on the debate, Dale. I've learned something today, and what I've learned today, I think, will sharpen my ability to perform better in future debates. And that's what it's all about. I always want a debate to be a learning experience for me. And if it's not, then I feel like I'm a little bit disappointed, because if I don't learn something, if I don't improve and grow, which I always need to do, then my time was not as productive as it could have been. And so I see that as a disadvantage. So usually when I have the debates, well, in my first debate with Juan, I introduced the debate by saying that I conceded the debate. And the reason that I conceded the debate in the beginning was I wanted to make the point that my interest is not in winning a debate. My interest is in pursuing truth. And the fact that if I win a debate, that doesn't mean that the truth has been exposed and the truth has won the day. I can win a debate and we can still end up with less than the truth. And so I would rather the truth be exposed and the truth be expressed than win a debate, and that doesn't really mean much to me. So and I don't think I conceded this debate with Juan, although I probably should have, because I had the same approach to the resurrection debate that I do the other debates that we've had, and that is that I don't want to win this debate. I want the truth to be known. And if the truth is known as a result of this debate, even if the truth is known by exposing my mistakes, then I consider that a win.
Yeah, sounds good. Like I said, yeah, the goal of winning is always just a secondary means to an end. This is the way I see it, right? Like you want to win because you believe you've got the truth, but insofar as it turns out the other side has the truth, and I find that out in a debate, great. I'm sort of become famous for conceding a debate with a Muslim, the Orthodox Muslim, where I don't think in terms of truth, I still believe I had the truth, and I even believe that after our debate. But I could concede for the purposes of the debate, he was the better debater. He had better rhetorical skills, and he stumped me a few times and stuff. So yeah, cool. I lost the debate. I'll learn for next time, and I'll get him next time. But all that ultimately matters is use this as a tool to discover the truth, kind of thing. So yeah.
You'll get revenge.
I'll get my revenge. So I'll get you next time, ortho Muslim. But yeah. Awesome.
Well, and I think Juan can improve in his debating skills, and I think I can improve in my debating skills. I think we can all improve, and this is not who has the better debating skills, and it's not who is the most articulate, who sounds the most professional. This is about pursuing truth and grappling with the issues together. And I can think of I can think of actually very few people that I would rather do that than with Juan, because I think Juan is interested in the truth, and I don't sense this desire to win on Juan's part. I don't get that from his attitude at all. And that's another reason why I compliment him so often. These compliments are sincere. I'm not flattering him. I'm complimenting him because I believe that these things are true. I believe that Juan is a gracious and sincere person, and I enjoy conversing with him just because of that fact. I see no arrogance and no pride, no spitefulness or anything like that, and that's the kind of character trait that you want in a debate, and I think that will increase the chances that we will arrive at the truth instead of decreasing them. So I appreciate it, Juan. Thank you for having that debate with me. I would like to do more in the future, and there are plenty of other tributaries that we could pursue, by the way, from our conversation today, Dale. We could talk about the historical evidence test, and we could explore that in more detail. And we could talk about whether the whether a historical argument or whether a historical document or account is reliable, and why should we believe that they're reliable. And we could talk about the nature of evidence, the nature of human testimony. There's all sorts of additional details that we could explore here, and so there's plenty of material that this conversation today has actually spawned, and it may have raised more question than it answered, and that's okay with me. So I'll give you a last comment, and then we'll sign off.
All right, sounds good. Yeah. It was interesting going back and rewatching this when I was preparing to do the review and stuff like that, because sometimes you pick up stuff that you didn't hear when you're originally in the moment and stuff. So I think there was a lot of very interesting and good nuggets in this debate that could lead to further exploration and further research on the part of viewers and stuff like that on both sides. So yeah, I think your guys' arguments were very provocative and raised questions, like you said, and that sort of thing. So I appreciated it from that front. But yeah, other than that, just generally speaking, yeah, I always love coming on and being on Juan's show, and I like being on Phil's show, and vice versa, having you guys on my show, whatever the topic is. It's always a good time and stuff like that. So it just so happens, yeah, this one on the resurrection, clearly an essential issue. So it's one of the most important topics of the Christian faith that you and I were dealing with and reviewing here. So thanks for inviting me on, and I look forward to doing more shows.
All right. Well,
sorry. One announcement for the fans, and then I promise I'll shut up. I have. Okay, yeah. So part 2. So last week I debated the atheist David Johnson from Skeptics and Seekers on the topic: did Jesus and the New Testament abolish the Old Testament? And unfortunately, we had a technical error, so we got cut off after 2 hours. So I will be posting up later this week part 2, where we finish off the debate on that front and realize that no, Christianity did not abolish the Old Testament.
okay, and when is that scheduled?
So I'm recording tomorrow, but I'll probably post it up later on or something later this week. So yeah, or maybe vice versa. Maybe I'll do the part 2, and then I'll post this on my channel on Thursday or Friday. So yeah, look out.
Okay,
tomorrow.
so that part 2 is that part 2 is not going to be live then. Okay, so
no,
right.
No.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. Any other upcoming events you want to talk about? You want to just let everybody know real quick?
What else do I have? So I'm talking with Tavo again. He's coming on. No, sorry. I'm going to be a guest on Tavo San Abry's channel. For once, I'm a guest talking with Tavo, and he's going to be talking to me about the existence of God, as well as Shroud of Turin. He's getting very interested in that. So I don't know if you know Tavo on your end, Phil, but he's great because he's a lifelong atheist. But he's just, because of the arguments for the resurrection and stuff, he's been convinced that Jesus, the Jesus of Christianity, is God's Messiah and is divine, and he rose from the dead. He still doesn't commit to being a Christian fully, but he's heavily leaning towards that. So it's fascinating seeing him almost transitioning there. But I'm going to be a guest on his channel, and yeah, he's been doing great work on his end for the Christian faith, and spreading his awareness as a former hard-hearted unbeliever who's now seeing the truth. So yeah.
Wow. Well, that's exciting. Yeah, that's a little bit more exciting, but in the same category. I wrote a 550-page book on Calvinism called Calvin's Desperation, and I spent 3 years writing and researching that book. And when Leighton Flowers was out visiting in Colorado, he and I were on my way on their way to the ranch I was living on to grill ribeyes, and he said, "Phil, I got some news for you that I think you're going to enjoy." I said, "What's that?" And he said, I heard about a pastor who had read your book on Calvinism, and on the basis of reading your book, he abandoned Calvinism and rejected it just because he read your book on Calvinism. And that made me extremely, extremely happy. And I thought, that made all the work that I put into that book worthwhile. Just that one person who was convinced and influenced by the arguments in that book made it all worthwhile. So, but it's even more exciting to hear someone who is on the verge of becoming a Christian. And so I pray that happens more. I pray it happens with Juan. I hope Juan doesn't mind that I'm praying for him, because he would make an outstanding Christian, and he would be such an asset to the kingdom of God. So, and then, but I also, real quick, before we sign off, I wanted to mention just one upcoming event for me. I'm going to be a guest on the Godless Granny podcast live on February 21st. I think it's going to be live. I don't think that she's going to record that, but that's Kelly Pearsall. She used to be a Christian and has rejected Christianity and has become an atheist, and now her channel is called The Godless Granny, and she has lots of discussions concerning the existence of God, the truth of Christianity, and so on. And oddly enough, Kelly and I are going to be discussing my latest book, Deconstructing Junk Theology. And I had a conversation with Bill Cluck, who is part of the Atheist and Christian Book Club, who recently converted from atheism to theism, although not all the way to Christianity. He used to be a Christian, then he became an atheist, and within the last year, he has transitioned from atheism back to theism, but not necessarily all the way back to Christianity. And I had a conversation with him about this conversation with Godless Granny, and I said, why does Kelly want to talk about theological errors in Christianity? And I said, I didn't think that atheists were interested in theological accuracy and in biblical fidelity. And he said, oh, they are. And so apparently atheists, or at least some of them, are interested in theological errors, erroneous theology. And that's what I wrote about in my book. And so I'm going to be talking to Kelly, the Godless Granny, about my book, Deconstructing Junk Theology, and we're going to talk about why some theology is junk theology, according to a sound reading of Scripture. So that's going to be, I think it's going to be live, and again, it's going to be on February 21st at 2:30 p.m. Mountain Time. So.
Perfect. I'll definitely tune in to support. That's the day I have the show with Tavo, but I should be free. Oh, actually, never mind. Okay, no, I'm going to be busy at 3, but I'll tune in for the first half an hour. I promise.
Okay,
and so
sounds
show
good.
My support. All right. God bless.
All right. Well, enough of this nonsense. We've gone on for almost 3 hours and 20 minutes, so we'll go ahead and sign off, and I will look forward to further conversations based on what we talked about today. And I'll sign off with this: Jesus is Lord, so follow him no matter what the cost is. And thank you for listening. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for being patient with all of our technical difficulties. And until next time,